My wife and stepdaughter drained our joint bank account and violently kicked me out of the house I paid for. She stood on the porch and laughed directly in my face, telling me I was a useless old man who was absolutely nothing without her. Then she slammed the heavy front door, shutting me out into the cold afternoon. 2 hours later, she called my phone completely sobbing and hysterically begging for my help. I simply smiled and hung up. I am Leon Sterling. I am 70 years old, and I recently learned that the people sleeping under your roof can be your absolute worst enemies. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to incredibly toxic family members who completely underestimated your intelligence. For my entire adult life, I projected the quiet, humble image of a standard working-class man. I spent decades working as a regional logistics manager in Atlanta, Georgia. I wore heavy work boots and faded denim jeans. I drove a reliable old pickup truck and never bragged about my finances. My wife Renee completely hated my humble lifestyle. She is a 62-year-old black woman who is entirely consumed by her own vanity and an endless thirst for high society status. She constantly belittled my career, calling me a simple warehouse worker. She had absolutely no idea that decades ago I developed a highly complex routing software algorithm that was eventually adopted by massive global shipping conglomerates. I legally hold highly lucrative software patents that quietly generate $15 million a year in pure passive income. I kept that massive offshore wealth completely hidden because I quickly realized that Renee and her daughter only loved the things that money could buy. Her biological daughter Jada is 39 years old. I helped raise her, but she grew up to be incredibly spoiled, entitled, and entirely dependent on her mother to fund a fake, luxurious internet influencer lifestyle. She married a 42-year-old white man named Tristan. Tristan introduced himself as a highly successful cryptocurrency expert and a brilliant tech venture capitalist. In reality, he was a fast-talking, arrogant fraud who constantly used subtle racist microaggressions against me. He called me old school and told me I simply did not have the mental capacity to understand modern high-level wealth. He was secretly running a massive financial Ponzi scheme and was actively drowning in toxic corporate debt. I knew all of this because my private wealth management attorneys ran extensive background checks on him, but I stayed completely quiet and played the role of the foolish retired old man. Yesterday afternoon, I drove my old truck back to the beautiful suburban house I had faithfully paid the mortgage on for 20 solid years. I pulled into the driveway and immediately noticed something was terribly wrong. There were 4 large, cheap black plastic garbage bags sitting aggressively on the pristine concrete of my front porch. I parked my truck and walked slowly up the brick pathway. I recognized the fabric of my favorite winter coat spilling out of one of the poorly tied bags. My entire life had been carelessly shoved into cheap plastic trash bags. Before I could even reach for the door handle, the heavy wooden front door swung wide open. Renee was standing right in the center of the grand foyer. She was wearing an expensive silk robe and her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. Jada was standing directly behind her, holding her expensive mobile phone and smirking. Tristan leaned against the expensive mahogany staircase wall wearing a tailored designer suit, with a completely smug and arrogant expression permanently plastered across his face. I stopped on the top step of the porch and looked at my clothes in the garbage bags. "What exactly is the meaning of this, Renee?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm and entirely flat. Renee let out a loud, highly condescending laugh that echoed out into the quiet suburban street. "The meaning is that your time here is officially over, Leon," she announced proudly, tilting her chin up to look down at me. "I am completely done living with a man who has absolutely no ambition and no future. You are a useless old man who has contributed nothing to my grand vision for this family. You are nothing without me." Tristan stepped forward from the staircase, sliding his hands into his expensive tailored pockets. "Let me explain it to you in simple terms so your tired old brain can understand," Leon Tristan said smoothly, his voice dripping with intense, unearned arrogance. "Your wife finally woke up and realized she needed a real man to manage her financial portfolio. Sitting on cash in a traditional bank is what poor, uneducated people do. So Renee made a brilliant executive decision today." Renee smiled brightly and placed her hand affectionately on Tristan's shoulder. "I went to the bank this morning, Leon," she declared with absolute arrogant pride. "I officially closed our primary joint savings account. I withdrew the entire balance. Every single penny of the $400,000 we had in that account is gone." I wired the entire massive sum directly into Tristan's new technology startup company this morning. He is going to triple that investment in 6 months using high-frequency cryptocurrency trading. That $400,000 was supposed to be the life savings from my visible pension and my logistics career. She had completely drained the account without saying a single word to me and handed a massive fortune directly to a known corporate criminal. "Do not look so pathetic, old man," Jada sneered, completely abandoning any fake respect she ever pretended to have for her stepfather. "My husband is going to make us incredibly wealthy. You would just let that money rot in a savings account until you died. Grab your cheap clothes and get off our property before we call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." Tristan smirked and nodded in agreement. "You heard the ladies," Tristan added maliciously. "This house is legally in Renee's name now. You are officially homeless. Go find a cheap apartment on the south side of the city where you actually belong." They stood there in the grand foyer, completely united in their toxic greed and their breathtaking betrayal. They fully expected me to fall to my knees on the hard concrete. They wanted me to cry loudly and beg for forgiveness. They wanted the absolute ultimate satisfaction of completely destroying my life. But I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I did not argue about the massive sum of money they had just brazenly stolen from my account. I looked at Renee and saw the ugly, greedy monster she truly was. I looked at Tristan and saw a terrified, desperate rat wearing a very expensive suit. I knew exactly what Tristan was secretly doing with his fake technology startup. My forensic accountants had already discovered that Tristan was utilizing highly illegal, unregistered offshore cryptocurrency wallets to hide his massive Ponzi scheme from the federal government. By convincing Renee to blindly wire $400,000 of domestic cash directly into those flagged international offshore accounts, Tristan had just made a catastrophic, fatal error. He thought he was stealing my retirement money to save his drowning company. He did not realize that the United States government heavily monitors massive international wire transfers for severe anti-money laundering violations. Renee had just proudly pulled the trigger on a massive federal financial weapon aimed directly at her own head. I looked at the three of them standing comfortably inside the beautiful house I had faithfully paid for. I slowly reached down and picked up the 2 plastic garbage bags containing my clothing. I pulled my mobile phone out of my pocket. I did not call the local police. I called a highly exclusive premium black car transportation service to pick me up immediately. Renee frowned deeply, her arrogant smile slipping just a tiny fraction. "What are you doing, Leon?" she demanded, clearly confused by my total lack of panic. "I just told you I took all of your money. You are completely broke." I hoisted the black bags over my shoulder and looked directly into her eyes. I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that completely unnerved her. "I heard you perfectly, Renee," I replied, my voice incredibly smooth and perfectly steady. "You made your executive decision. I sincerely hope you and Tristan enjoy the massive returns on your brilliant investment. Have a wonderful afternoon." I turned my back on them and walked slowly down the brick pathway toward the street. I heard Tristan scoff loudly behind me, calling me a cowardly old fool. I heard the heavy wooden front door slam violently shut, permanently severing my ties to that highly toxic family. The sleek black luxury sedan pulled up to the curb exactly 2 minutes later. The professional driver stepped out and opened the rear door for me, respectfully taking the plastic garbage bags and placing them in the trunk. I slid into the comfortable leather seat and instructed the driver to take me to the most expensive luxury hotel in the downtown financial district. I sat in the back of the quiet vehicle, watching the suburban trees roll past the tinted windows. My heart was perfectly calm. They had absolutely no idea what they just did. They thought they had successfully stolen my entire life savings and kicked me into the dirty street. They thought they were brilliant, untouchable financial masterminds. They did not know that I was a silent multimillionaire who had just deliberately let them steal that specific $400,000. The heavy iron trap was already flawlessly set, and the silent countdown clock was rapidly ticking. I simply leaned back into the plush leather seat and patiently waited for the massive federal explosion to completely vaporize their entire miserable existence. The black luxury sedan pulled smoothly up to the grand entrance of the most exclusive 5-star hotel in the downtown Atlanta financial district. The highly professional valet immediately opened my car door and respectfully reached for the 2 cheap black plastic garbage bags sitting in the trunk. He did not judge my worn, faded clothing or my terrible, embarrassing luggage. He simply smiled warmly and carried my belongings directly to the private express elevator reserved entirely for the presidential penthouse suite. I paid exactly $5,000 for a single night in this magnificent, sprawling room, using a highly secure corporate black card linked to my massive, hidden offshore wealth. The heavy wooden double doors smoothly opened into a massive living space completely surrounded by towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The beautiful room offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the bustling city stretching out toward the horizon. I left the pathetic plastic garbage bag sitting abandoned on the pristine white marble floor of the grand foyer. I did not need those old faded clothes anymore because that weak, humble version of Leon Sterling was officially entirely dead. I walked into the massive master bathroom and turned on the hot water. I stood silently under the wide premium rainfall showerhead, letting the warm, soothing water wash away 20 long years of highly toxic marital stress and incredibly heavy emotional abuse. I stepped out onto the heated tile floor and wrapped myself in a luxurious white cotton hotel robe. I felt completely reborn, entirely powerful, and untouched by their pathetic consuming greed. I walked over to the digital console and ordered a premium aged steak and a tall glass of expensive bourbon from the luxury room service menu. While I was peacefully enjoying the incredible city view from my high-altitude sanctuary, my arrogant wife Renee and my completely fraudulent son-in-law Tristan were unknowingly stepping directly into a massive federal bear trap. I deliberately let them steal that specific $400,000 from my visible domestic joint savings account. I knew exactly what Renee was actively planning to do with that money because my private wealth management attorneys had already thoroughly investigated Tristan's highly suspicious technology startup. Tristan was not a brilliant venture capitalist or a cryptocurrency genius. He was actively running a highly illegal and deeply unstable financial Ponzi scheme completely built on massive corporate lies and stolen investor capital. To successfully hide his stolen money from the strict federal government, Tristan was actively utilizing a massive dark network of unregistered offshore digital wallets based entirely in non-compliant foreign territories. Those specific offshore crypto accounts were already heavily flagged by international financial authorities for severe money laundering violations and massive corporate fraud. Renee truly thought she was a brilliant financial mastermind when she proudly walked into our local domestic bank branch and officially authorized a massive $400,000 international wire transfer directly into Tristan's shady corporate shell accounts. She completely believed she was brilliantly securing her wealthy luxury future and leaving me destitute to rot in the filthy city gutters. But Renee is a highly arrogant fool who fundamentally does not understand how modern global banking algorithms actually operate behind closed doors. The United States government utilizes incredibly sophisticated automated digital tracking software to constantly monitor massive international cash movements. When Renee willingly wired $400,000 of domestic savings directly into a heavily flagged unregistered offshore cryptocurrency wallet, she instantly tripped a massive silent federal alarm. She triggered an automatic and entirely unavoidable asset freeze officially mandated by the Department of Homeland Security and the Internal Revenue Service under strict federal anti-money laundering laws. The federal government does not send polite warning letters to your home mailbox when they suspect massive international money laundering and severe corporate financial fraud. They act with immediate and completely terrifying digital financial violence. I knew the advanced automated federal algorithms operated entirely in real time without any human hesitation. The exact moment the local bank teller hit the final computer authorization button on that massive international wire transfer, the invisible digital net was completely cast over Renee's entire financial existence. I sat down in a plush velvet armchair, resting my bare feet comfortably on the soft imported carpet. I picked up my heavy crystal glass of aged bourbon and took a slow, deliberate, satisfying sip, feeling the warm, rich liquid slide smoothly down my throat. I looked at the sleek digital clock resting quietly on the solid marble side table next to me. Exactly 2 hours had passed since Renee laughed directly in my face and violently slammed the heavy custom front door, shutting me out into the cold afternoon wind. I reached deep into the pocket of my thick white cotton robe and pulled out a cheap prepaid plastic burner phone. I specifically purchased the untraceable communication device for this exact highly anticipated moment. I placed the small black plastic phone onto the glass coffee table and patiently waited for the inevitable absolute destruction to finally reach my quiet room. Exactly 5 minutes later, the cheap plastic phone began to vibrate and ring loudly across the quiet penthouse suite. I did not rush to answer. I let it ring 4 times, savoring the total reversal of power. I finally picked up the device and pressed the accept button. I did not say a comforting word. I simply held the phone to my ear and listened silently to the chaotic sounds of pure terror echoing loudly through the speaker. "Leon, please tell me you are there!" Renee screamed wildly, her voice completely unrecognizable from the smug, arrogant woman who had happily kicked me out just 2 hours ago. She was sobbing hysterically, gasping for air exactly as if she was physically drowning in a dark ocean. "Leon, you have to help us right now," Renee wailed loudly, entirely consumed by panic. "Something is terribly wrong with the bank." Jada and I went to a luxury boutique to celebrate our new technology investment, and my premium credit card was violently declined by the machine. I tried to use my standard debit card and the electronic machine confiscated it. I called the regional bank manager and he coldly told me our accounts are completely locked. Not just the joint account, Leon, but my personal checking account and Jada's savings account too. Everything is frozen solid like a block of ice, and the bank manager refused to tell me why. He said my social security number was officially flagged by a highly secure federal agency, and he legally could not discuss the matter any further, or he would lose his job. Renee was weeping so violently she could barely form a coherent sentence. Jada was screaming loudly in the background, crying that her digital payment applications were completely disabled, and her internet influencer financial accounts were officially showing 0 available cash balances. They had absolutely no usable cash in their expensive designer wallets. They could not even buy a gallon of gas or a cup of coffee from a convenience store. Their entire luxurious fake reality was completely violently erased in less than 120 minutes. Renee desperately begged me to call the bank and fix the massive error, claiming it must be a terrible mistake because she was a wealthy, respectable suburban woman who never broke the law. I listened to her pathetic, desperate wailing with absolute freezing indifference. The sweet sound of her financial destruction was better than the expensive bourbon resting in my glass. I let her cry for another solid minute before I finally spoke. My voice was perfectly calm, incredibly smooth, and entirely devoid of any human sympathy. "It is absolutely not a simple bank mistake, Renee," I explained slowly, ensuring every single sharp word cut deeply into her panicked, racing mind. "You did not just successfully steal my hard-earned life savings today. You willingly wired a sum of domestic cash directly into an unregistered offshore cryptocurrency wallet heavily flagged for massive money laundering. You triggered a massive federal criminal investigation. The Department of Homeland Security and the Internal Revenue Service have officially frozen your entire personal financial identity. Your social security number is locked and blacklisted. You have $0 to your name, and there is nothing I can do to save your miserable life." Renee gasped loudly, paralyzed by the horrifying reality of her own deeply arrogant actions. "Leon, please, you cannot just leave us like this to rot," she begged, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "You are nothing without me, Renee," I replied, repeating the exact same insult she hurled at me just 2 hours ago. I pressed the red button and ended the pathetic call. I turned the cheap burner phone off and tossed it casually onto the smooth marble table. I picked up my crystal glass of aged bourbon and looked out over the beautiful glowing city skyline, finally feeling perfect lasting peace. The bright morning sun flooded into my luxury hotel penthouse, illuminating the pristine white marble floors and the expensive modern furniture beautifully. I sat at the grand dining table enjoying a fresh cup of premium dark roast coffee. Sitting directly across from me was my elite wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance. Arthur was a highly sophisticated man who successfully managed the hidden financial empires of billionaires and massive global corporations. He opened his sleek silver briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of heavily encrypted financial documents. I did not need to wear my old faded work clothes anymore. I was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit my broad shoulders perfectly. Arthur placed the top document on the glass table and smiled warmly. He officially confirmed that my massive offshore financial trust was performing exactly as we had carefully planned. Decades ago, while I was working as a humble regional logistics manager, I spent my quiet evenings writing highly complex computer code. I developed a revolutionary routing software algorithm that was eventually purchased and fully adopted by the largest global shipping conglomerates in the entire world. I legally secured the exclusive software patents and structured the massive corporate payouts entirely in the dark. Those specific patents quietly generated exactly $15 million a year in pure passive income, completely hidden from my incredibly greedy wife Renee. I was not a poor, retired warehouse worker begging for respect. I was a highly secretive shadow billionaire commanding a massive, untraceable fortune. Arthur handed me the updated financial ledgers, clearly showing my absolute total liquid assets stretching far beyond anything my treacherous family could ever possibly comprehend. My quiet, humble life was an absolute illusion created perfectly to completely protect my massive financial empire from their endless, toxic, consuming greed entirely. While I was peacefully reviewing my massive growing wealth, my arrogant white son-in-law Tristan was experiencing the most terrifying morning of his entire miserable life. My private security team had successfully hacked into the interior security cameras of Renee's expensive suburban house. I opened my secure laptop and watched the live high-definition video feed of my former living room. Tristan was completely losing his mind. He was frantically pacing back and forth across the expensive hardwood floors, sweating profusely through his designer dress shirt. The smug, confident corporate persona he constantly projected had completely evaporated into thin air. He was violently clutching his mobile phone, screaming at his junior corporate executives. Tristan desperately needed that specific $400,000 Renee had proudly stolen from my joint savings account. He needed that massive sum of liquid cash to artificially keep his highly illegal financial Ponzi scheme afloat. But because Renee had blindly wired the domestic funds directly into heavily flagged unregistered offshore cryptocurrency wallets, the federal government had instantly frozen the entire massive transaction. The money was completely trapped in a digital federal vault, completely inaccessible to anyone. This sudden catastrophic freeze triggered an absolute massive crisis for Tristan's fake technology startup. Tomorrow morning, his corporate company was legally required to meet a massive payroll deadline. Hundreds of his employees and junior developers were expecting their bi-weekly paychecks to officially clear their bank accounts. If that massive payroll completely bounced, his entire fake corporate empire would violently collapse overnight. Tristan knew exactly what happens when a highly publicized technology startup completely misses a massive payroll deadline. The angry unpaid employees would immediately take their severe grievances to social media and local news outlets, creating absolute panic everywhere, completely, instantly, forever ending his deeply pathetic corporate life completely. The sudden public exposure of massive financial insolvency would instantly trigger widespread panic among his wealthy private investors. Those highly wealthy investors would aggressively demand an immediate full audit of his corporate books. A deep forensic audit would instantly expose the terrifying reality that his entire venture capital firm was nothing but a massive illegal Ponzi scheme built entirely on stolen money and highly fraudulent corporate lies. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation would violently raid his sleek downtown offices before the end of the current week. Tristan was staring directly down the dark, terrifying barrel of a 20-year federal prison sentence, and he had absolutely zero escape routes. He could not simply walk into a traditional domestic bank and request a massive commercial bridge loan. A traditional commercial bank would require a thorough background check and a deep review of his corporate financial history. That level of intense scrutiny would instantly expose his massive criminal fraud perfectly. He was completely cut off from traditional legal financing options forever. He desperately needed to find a highly secretive, unregulated shadow lender who would hand him millions of dollars in liquid cash without asking any difficult legal questions or requiring a massive federal audit. I watched Tristan collapse onto the expensive living room sofa, holding his head in his shaking hands. Renee was sitting right next to him, weeping loudly and completely begging him to fix the massive problem entirely. She was completely terrified because her own personal bank accounts and credit cards were currently frozen solid by Homeland Security. She desperately needed Tristan to be the brilliant financial savior he always falsely claimed to be absolutely every single day of his miserable life, perfectly, completely, totally, forever today, entirely without any true, real failure completely. Tristan looked at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. He violently blamed her for the catastrophic federal freeze, completely ignoring the fact that he was the exact person who instructed her to use the highly illegal offshore cryptocurrency wallets initially. He aggressively told Renee that he had absolutely no choice left. He had to rapidly reach out to a dark network of aggressive private equity investors who specialized in highly predatory, massive emergency corporate loans entirely. These specific shadow lenders operated entirely outside the strict boundaries of federal regulations forever. They happily provided massive sums of instant liquid cash to desperate failing corporate executives, but they charged astronomically high interest rates and demanded absolute unyielding physical collateral perfectly. Tristan told Renee he was going to fully leverage the entire equity of his fake startup company to successfully secure the emergency bridge loan before the sun went down today completely. He genuinely believed he could simply borrow his way out of the massive federal crisis and completely outsmart the entire financial system perfectly. I smiled a cold, highly calculated smile and gently closed the lid of my secure laptop smoothly. I looked directly across the beautiful glass dining table at my brilliant wealth management attorney quietly. The desperate rat is actively searching for a massive piece of poisoned cheese, Arthur. I said, my voice perfectly smooth and entirely calm today. I want to be the exact person who personally feeds it to him this afternoon completely. Arthur immediately understood the absolute brilliant depth of my financial strategy instantly. I firmly instructed Arthur to instantly utilize a tiny fraction of my massive offshore war chest entirely. I told him to quietly establish a highly anonymous offshore private equity firm completely owned and entirely controlled perfectly by my own trust today, right now, completely. I wanted my new shadow company to legally operate as an incredibly aggressive predatory lending syndicate instantly. Arthur rapidly typed on his encrypted computer, utilizing his elite global network of corporate fixers to actively intercept Tristan's desperate search for emergency capital today. We were going to officially offer Tristan the exact massive sum of liquid cash he desperately needed to successfully cover his catastrophic payroll deadline tomorrow morning completely. We were going to willingly hand him the thick, heavy rope he needed to completely hang himself entirely without any hesitation whatsoever. Tristan was actively hunting for a mysterious dark corporate savior to rescue his miserable criminal life perfectly. He had absolutely no idea that the massive, anonymous, offshore firm, eagerly waiting to instantly approve his massive predatory loan, was actually owned and entirely controlled by the very same 70-year-old black man he had proudly kicked out into the street just 24 hours ago completely. The massive steel trap was being perfectly set by my incredibly brilliant legal team smoothly. We designed the highly complex loan documents to include the most destructive absolute default clauses ever written in the entire history of modern corporate finance today. I wanted to completely own every single piece of his fake technology company and strip away absolutely everything he possessed entirely. I looked out the large glass windows of my beautiful luxury penthouse suite feeling deeply satisfied completely. My arrogant family members genuinely thought they had successfully destroyed my quiet life and stolen my entire retirement savings yesterday. They completely failed to realize they had violently awakened a highly dangerous, massive corporate titan entirely capable of wiping them entirely off the absolute face of the entire financial earth completely and totally forever today, perfectly right now, without any true mercy, completely today. The morning sun climbed over the beautiful Atlanta skyline, reflecting off the thick glass windows of my luxury penthouse suite. I sat quietly in my leather chair, drinking my dark roast coffee and watching the flat-screen television mounted on the marble wall. My wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance, was sitting directly across from me, reviewing the encrypted financial reports on his secure laptop. While we were peacefully planning the absolute destruction of my fraudulent son-in-law, my spoiled, entitled stepdaughter Jada was actively panicking inside her suburban bedroom. The federal government had completely frozen her personal bank accounts and disabled her premium credit cards. She had absolutely zero access to the lavish funds she constantly used to maintain her fake internet influencer lifestyle. Jada was a 39-year-old woman who fundamentally refused to work a real, honest job. She survived entirely on the stolen money her mother Renee willingly funneled to her from my hard-earned retirement savings. Now that the domestic funds were locked tight by Homeland Security, Jada was entirely cut off from her expensive daily beauty treatments, her luxury shopping sprees, and her high-end dining experiences. She was desperate to explain her sudden embarrassing lack of wealth to her massive audience of gullible online followers. She desperately needed a highly compelling public narrative to justify her catastrophic financial crisis without exposing her criminal actions. She needed her followers to view her as a deeply tragic, noble victim instead of a broke, pathetic woman who actively participated in stealing $400,000 from her elderly black stepfather. So she decided to weaponize the toxic power of modern social media to completely assassinate my personal character and entirely rewrite the truth. She grabbed her expensive mobile phone and deliberately prepared to broadcast a highly destructive absolute lie directly to the entire global internet. Arthur tapped a few keys on his secure encrypted laptop and smoothly transferred a live social media video feed directly to the large flat-screen television hanging on the wall. I watched quietly as Jada's face filled the bright screen. She was sitting on the floor of her heavily decorated bedroom wearing a completely oversized faded gray sweater intentionally chosen to make her look incredibly small, fragile, and entirely overwhelmed by intense emotional trauma. She had scrubbed her face clean of her usual heavy makeup, leaving her bare skin looking intentionally pale and deeply exhausted. She looked directly into the camera lens with wide, fake, fearful eyes and took a very deep, highly theatrical, shaky breath. The entire digital performance was absolutely sickening to witness in real time. It was a true masterclass in extreme sociopathic psychological manipulation, completely designed to deceive her millions of ignorant followers. She smoothly began the broadcast by falsely introducing herself as a terrified, devoted daughter who was breaking under the crushing weight of a horrifying private family tragedy. She boldly told her online audience that her elderly black stepfather had recently suffered a completely catastrophic permanent mental breakdown. She aggressively, falsely claimed my mind had entirely deteriorated into severe, violent, late-stage dementia over the past few highly stressful weeks. She looked deeply sadly into the camera lens and forced a single large fake tear to slowly roll down her cheek. She lied to the entire world, confidently claiming that I had rapidly become physically violent, deeply financially abusive, and dangerously, entirely erratic inside our family home. She told her millions of completely captivated followers that I had abandoned my loving family and vanished entirely into the dark, dangerous streets of downtown Atlanta, completely out of my mind. She falsely said I was violently refusing all necessary medical help and actively squandering our family life savings on wild, dangerous, paranoid delusions. But the deeply malicious brilliance of her fake digital performance completely arrived in the second half of her viral social media video. Jada expertly planted the exact specific psychological seed required to publicly justify the massive financial fraud and the completely stolen $400,000. She cried incredibly loudly directly into the microphone, claiming that my severe mental decline had rapidly put our family in extreme, absolute financial danger. She said out of pure, desperate, unconditional family love, she and her mother, Renee, had absolutely no other choice but to legally step in and aggressively take over my private personal banking affairs to save me from destroying our beautiful family legacy forever. She actively, intentionally painted the massive illegal withdrawal of my retirement savings not as a massive federal wire fraud crime, but as a noble, desperate act of deep family love trying to protect a sick, violent old man from his own tragic, terrifying insanity. She openly begged the massive global public audience for their daily continuous prayers, their immediate generous financial donations, and their deep personal understanding during this incredibly dark, completely confusing time. The digital public response to her fake theatrical performance was immediate and entirely overwhelming. The viral lying video rapidly accumulated over 4 million unique views in exactly less than 6 hours. The internet is a massive, highly mindless, hungry machine that feeds absolutely exclusively on unverified raw emotion and toxic public outrage. Millions of absolute strangers who knew absolutely nothing about my real life or my long decades of hard, honest work immediately sided with the fragile, crying young woman on their glowing digital screens. They absolutely believed every single malicious, terrible word she spoke without ever demanding a single tiny shred of actual, verifiable evidence. The public comments section, located directly beneath her viral video, quickly transformed into a toxic, dangerous wasteland of misplaced sympathy and extreme racial hostility. People aggressively called me a dangerous, violent old thug who was incredibly lucky to have such a caring, loving stepdaughter looking out for my best interests. They enthusiastically praised Jada as a complete saint and a noble modern hero for bravely stepping up to handle a volatile, dangerous, elderly black man. My arrogant, greedy wife Renee saw the rapidly growing wave of public support and immediately rushed to join the disgusting digital circus. She posted a long, highly emotional, detailed comment directly under the viral video, entirely validating every single lie her daughter had just told the world. Renee falsely claimed that her own heart was entirely shattered by her husband's rapid mental decline and her terrifying new financial reality. She publicly thanked Jada for taking the heavy burden of my complex financial affairs onto her capable shoulders. Then Renee committed her absolute most catastrophic federal legal mistake of the entire week. To maliciously capitalize on the massive wave of entirely misplaced public sympathy, Renee officially launched a highly public crowdfunding charity campaign page. She shamelessly asked the gullible public to immediately donate their hard-earned money to help her family survive this emotional tragedy and to cover the massive legal fees required to put me into a secure state psychiatric ward. Within 3 short hours, thousands of completely innocent strangers began heavily donating their personal money directly into Renee's fraudulent charity account. She was proudly scamming the general public to completely fund her luxury suburban lifestyle, completely unaware that she was aggressively committing massive federal wire fraud and severe illegal charity fraud on a highly visible public digital platform. My wealth management attorney Arthur Vance carefully watched the fraudulent public crowdfunding numbers rapidly climb on the television screen, and he became entirely furious. He slammed his heavy hand down onto the pristine glass table and loudly demanded immediate aggressive legal action against my highly toxic family. He firmly told me they were maliciously assassinating my personal character on a global scale simply to build a completely fake public defense for their federal financial crimes. Arthur stated, his voice incredibly tight with extreme professional legal frustration, that Jada was laying the psychological groundwork to successfully convince a potential federal jury that they stole my money out of pure medical necessity. He desperately wanted to immediately secure an emergency judicial cease and desist order and legally force every social media platform to completely scrub those highly fraudulent lying videos from the internet before noon today. I stood quietly by the large, thick glass window, calmly looking down at the incredibly busy downtown Atlanta traffic far below me. I slowly raised my right hand, signaling for absolute, complete, total silence in the massive luxury room. I firmly commanded my brilliant, aggressive lawyer to do absolutely nothing at all today. I strictly forbade him from filing any civil defamation lawsuits or sending any legal warning letters to my treacherous family. I told Arthur that we were going to let them happily build their massive, towering monument entirely out of highly toxic digital lies. I calmly explained that every single fake online tear and every single fraudulent charity donation was perfectly documenting their severe, massive federal crimes directly for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If we stopped them right now, they would simply claim we silenced them. I smiled softly. The digital clock inside my luxury penthouse suite silently moved forward, marking the absolute continuous passage of time. For me, time was a peaceful luxury. But for my arrogant son-in-law Tristan, time was a terrifying heavy weapon violently swinging directly toward his head. His entire fake corporate empire was currently standing on the very edge of a massive, catastrophic cliff. The federal government had completely frozen the $400,000 his wife had stolen from my retirement account. Because that massive sum of domestic cash was securely locked inside a digital federal vault, Tristan had absolutely no liquid capital left to artificially sustain his illegal financial Ponzi scheme. Tomorrow morning, his technology startup was legally required to process a massive corporate payroll. Hundreds of angry junior developers and highly suspicious private investors were eagerly waiting for their money to officially clear their bank accounts. If that payroll bounced, Tristan would immediately face a highly publicized corporate collapse, followed rapidly by a severe federal investigation and decades in a federal penitentiary. He was completely out of traditional options. Traditional commercial banks require extensive deep forensic audits before issuing emergency bridge loans, and a thorough audit would instantly expose his massive criminal fraud to the entire world. He desperately needed a massive infusion of unregulated dark cash to temporarily plug the massive holes in his sinking ship. He needed exactly $2 million in pure liquid cash by the end of the business day, and he had absolutely nothing of real value left to offer as collateral. His sports cars were leased, and his corporate office equipment was rented. The only physical asset possessing that kind of massive financial value belonged entirely to my greedy wife Renee. Tristan was a highly manipulative, fast-talking predator who knew exactly how to completely control the deeply vain women in his life. I watched the live high-definition security feed from my old living room on my secure, encrypted laptop. Tristan was actively circling Renee exactly like a starving shark sensing fresh blood in the dark water. Renee was sitting on the expensive velvet sofa, entirely panicked about her frozen personal bank accounts and her sudden terrifying lack of usable daily cash. Tristan sat down right next to her and smoothly grabbed her shaking hands. He looked deeply into her eyes and began spinning a completely masterful web of absolute toxic lies. He softly told Renee that his technology company was only experiencing a tiny temporary banking delay due to routine federal regulatory updates. He aggressively falsely promised her that a massive global tech conglomerate was actively preparing to buy his entire startup company for $30 million by the end of the current month. He painted a truly beautiful, highly intoxicating picture of massive generational wealth, private luxury jets, and exclusive billionaire galas. But he strictly warned her that if they missed the immediate payroll deadline tomorrow morning, the massive $30 million corporate buyout would completely, instantly evaporate into thin air forever. He told her they desperately needed a fast emergency bridge loan from a highly exclusive private equity firm to successfully cross the finish line. Then he softly delivered the absolute fatal blow. He told Renee the anonymous shadow lender required a massive piece of premium physical real estate to legally secure the $2 million emergency loan. He directly asked Renee to legally pledge the massive luxury suburban estate, the exact same beautiful house she had proudly kicked me out of yesterday, as absolute collateral. Renee was completely blinded by her own breathtaking arrogance and her deeply endless toxic greed. Any normal, rational human being would have immediately recognized the massive, terrifying red flags waving wildly in her face. A rational woman would never willingly risk the secure roof over her head to briefly fund a highly unstable technology startup. But Renee fundamentally believed she was a brilliant, elite financial player who was simply operating on a much higher intellectual level than the rest of the world. She truly thought she was brilliantly executing a highly sophisticated corporate maneuver that would permanently secure her status among the wealthy elite of Atlanta society. She did not bother to consult an independent financial advisor or carefully review Tristan's highly fabricated corporate ledgers. She simply looked at the greedy, arrogant man sitting next to her and eagerly agreed to legally sign away the total remaining equity of her beautiful, massive home. She genuinely believed the highly predatory loan was nothing more than a tiny, brief formality, a simple, temporary bridge carrying her directly toward a massive $30 million payday. She smiled brightly at Tristan, completely convinced they had successfully outsmarted the entire financial universe. She quickly ran upstairs to her heavily decorated master bedroom and proudly retrieved the official physical property deed from her hidden wall safe. It was the exact same property deed I had faithfully paid the heavy mortgage on for 20 long years, using my hard-earned physical labor. She excitedly handed the heavy legal document directly to Tristan, entirely unaware that she was actively, willingly placing her entire neck directly onto a very sharp, heavy steel guillotine. Tristan eagerly snatched the document from her hands, a sickening smile of absolute pure relief rapidly spreading across his sweating face. Early that afternoon, Tristan and Renee rapidly drove to a highly sleek, modern law office located deep inside the wealthy downtown financial district. The law firm completely specialized in highly discreet, unregistered private equity transactions and extremely aggressive offshore corporate lending. They were warmly greeted by a group of smiling professional corporate attorneys who immediately escorted them into a massive glass-walled executive boardroom. The attorneys placed a thick, heavy stack of incredibly dense legal contracts directly onto the polished mahogany table. The legal paperwork represented exactly $2 million in pure liquid cash, provided by an anonymous, highly secretive offshore private equity syndicate. Tristan and Renee sat down in the plush leather chairs, entirely consumed by their massive, blinding greed. They did not hire an independent lawyer to carefully read the incredibly dense, highly restrictive fine print printed on the heavy pages. Desperate, terrified corporate criminals completely ignore long-term financial consequences when massive federal investigations are actively knocking loudly on their doors. They eagerly and happily accepted the absolutely brutal predatory terms without asking a single critical question. The massive interest rates attached to the emergency bridge loan were astronomically completely illegal under standard domestic banking laws. The specific default penalties were immediate, incredibly severe, and entirely unforgiving. The most important legal clause clearly stated that if Tristan missed a single precisely timed payment, or if the imaginary $30 million tech buyout completely failed, the anonymous offshore lender possessed the absolute total legal right to immediately seize the luxury estate and violently evict them onto the street without any lengthy judicial court battle whatsoever. Renee proudly picked up the heavy, expensive pen and confidently signed her official name on the dotted line, legally handing over her entire massive home. I sat perfectly still inside my quiet, peaceful luxury hotel penthouse suite, actively watching the live, high-definition security feed from the sleek executive boardroom. My brilliant wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance, sat directly across from me, calmly watching my arrogant family eagerly sign away their entire miserable future. Tristan and Renee actually smiled warmly at each other and proudly shook hands with the expensive corporate lawyers, completely convinced they had successfully survived the massive financial storm. They believed they had found a magical, wealthy financial loophole, completely saving them from absolute total destruction. They truly thought the nameless, faceless offshore corporate entity handing them $2 million was their absolute ultimate saving grace. They had absolutely no idea that every single eager signature was another heavy, thick iron nail being violently hammered directly into their own wooden coffins. They had absolutely no idea that the highly secretive, anonymous offshore private equity firm granting the massive predatory loan was actually 100% completely owned and entirely controlled by my own massive offshore trust. The massive, beautiful steel trap was finally officially entirely sprung today. The heavy iron jaws slammed completely shut entirely around their weak ankles, and they were so incredibly foolish they did not even feel the intense, blinding physical pain yet. I slowly sat back in my comfortable plush velvet chair, staring happily at the frozen digital image of their smiling, ignorant faces on my secure tablet screen. I was now legally their absolute sole creditor. I legally owned the heavy, massive, toxic debt currently crushing Tristan's fake technology company. I officially owned the heavy mortgage to Renee's beautiful luxury suburban estate. I completely owned their entire pathetic, miserable futures. I took a slow, highly satisfying sip of my dark roast coffee, enjoying the incredible absolute silence completely right now. I patiently waited for the inevitable total collapse to violently destroy their pathetic fake reality without showing any true human mercy whatsoever today. I spent my entire adult life meticulously calculating the exact cost of basic household groceries. I always shopped at the discount supermarkets on the south side of the city, carefully comparing the prices of canned goods and frozen vegetables. But my daily reality had entirely shifted into a completely different universe. On a crisp Thursday afternoon, I decided to visit an incredibly exclusive high-end grocery market located deep inside the wealthy Buckhead district. I wanted to purchase premium cuts of meat and fresh organic produce to cook a proper healthy meal inside my beautiful luxury hotel penthouse suite today. I wore a perfectly tailored wool coat over a crisp, dark button-down shirt. I absolutely did not look like the starving, senile old man my stepdaughter Jada was currently crying about on the internet. I looked exactly like a highly sophisticated man who comfortably controlled a massive global financial empire. I pushed my sleek metal shopping cart down the pristine, brightly lit aisles, enjoying the quiet, refined atmosphere of the elite store. I was standing near the imported cheese display, completely relaxed, when I suddenly heard a highly familiar and deeply irritating loud voice echoing directly behind my back. I turned my head very slightly and looked directly down the adjacent aisle. My entitled stepdaughter Jada and my completely fraudulent son-in-law Tristan were standing near the expensive imported wine section. They looked incredibly stressed and deeply exhausted today. Their federal bank accounts were entirely frozen solid, but they were desperately trying to maintain their fake wealthy image in public. They were likely using a tiny hidden stash of emergency physical cash to buy luxury groceries. Tristan was aggressively gesturing with his hands while Jada simply stared blankly at the expensive, shiny marble floor, completely, totally defeated today. And then Jada slowly looked up from the ground. Her wide eyes locked directly onto mine across the busy grocery store. All the color instantly drained entirely from her face completely. She nudged Tristan sharply in the ribs and pointed a trembling manicured finger exactly in my specific direction. Tristan spun around rapidly and his jaw dropped open in absolute pure shock. They fully expected me to be actively freezing in a dirty alleyway wearing old rags and begging loudly for loose change today. Instead, they saw me standing confidently, looking incredibly healthy and entirely unbothered by their pathetic existence. I absolutely did not react to their panicked, desperate stares at all. I simply turned back to the display, selected a massive wedge of aged premium cheese, and placed it gently into my shopping cart. I calmly walked to the front checkout counter and happily paid for my expensive organic groceries using a premium-heavy black corporate card linked directly to my massive offshore financial trust. I walked smoothly out of the sliding glass doors directly into the massive concrete parking garage. The underground parking structure was dimly lit and completely empty in my specific highly secured private luxury section. My elite private security detail constantly instructed me to always park in highly isolated areas to properly maintain a clear, tactical defensive perimeter at all times. I walked very slowly toward my waiting luxury vehicle, quietly listening to the incredibly loud, aggressive sound of heavy, angry footsteps rapidly approaching from directly behind my back. Tristan and Jada were actively sprinting out of the grocery store, completely desperately trying to personally catch me before I could securely leave the dark premises. They genuinely thought they had just magically caught a massive lucky break, completely, totally today, absolutely right now, perfectly. They foolishly thought they finally possessed the perfect golden opportunity to physically intimidate me into total, absolute silence today. "Leon, wait right there!" Tristan shouted, his angry voice echoing incredibly loudly across the freezing cold concrete walls of the massive underground parking garage. I completely stopped walking and slowly turned around to personally face them directly. I stood perfectly still, holding my heavy paper grocery bag. Tristan marched aggressively directly up to me, completely, entirely invading my personal physical space entirely. His previously handsome face was violently twisted into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated, toxic rage entirely today. The completely fake, sophisticated corporate venture capitalist persona he usually constantly projected directly to his wealthy private clients completely, entirely vanished instantly into extremely thin air, perfectly. He was breathing incredibly heavily, his broad chest heaving violently with massive, toxic, physical adrenaline today. Jada flanked him completely on his right side, trying desperately to look highly intimidating, but failing absolutely miserably right now. "You think you are incredibly, extremely smart, you pathetic, useless old man," Tristan hissed viciously. Stepping so incredibly close, I could practically smell the highly bitter, stale coffee resting directly on his rapid, shaking breath right now. I slowly looked directly at Tristan with absolute, total, freezing physical indifference completely. I absolutely did not speak a single solitary word to him today. My deep, heavy silence completely, entirely infuriated his fragile, arrogant ego perfectly. He desperately wanted me to argue loudly back at him. He actively wanted me to cower violently in deep physical fear right now. When I completely, totally refused to actively play his highly pathetic screaming game, his deeply ingrained, disgusting white supremacy violently, aggressively boiled entirely directly upwards straight to the absolute very top surface of his entirely deeply rotten human soul today. "You truly need to listen to me very incredibly closely, you absolute ghetto mechanic," Tristan suddenly spat viciously, his deep, angry voice dripping heavily with incredibly intense, malicious, racist poison right now. "You absolutely do not ever deserve to shop in this incredibly wealthy, exclusive elite neighborhood today. You completely do not possess the proper elite education or the actual wealthy pedigree to comfortably manage any real money whatsoever. You are absolutely nothing but a deeply lucky retired warehouse worker who completely stumbled, totally blindly, onto a tiny, pathetic golden ticket, perfectly, completely today, right here, perfectly, completely, totally, now." Jada stepped forward, entirely complicit in the violent threat building against her own elderly black stepfather today. "You really need to listen to him, Leon," Jada yelled loudly, her voice trembling with completely fake, tough energy. "We currently hold every single winning card right now. I already told the entire internet that you are clinically insane and highly unpredictably violent. If you try to go to the authorities, they will just think it is another crazy delusion from a sick old black man. We will have you thrown into a padded psychiatric cell before the sun goes down perfectly today." Tristan smiled a deeply sick, twisted smile, entirely convinced that they had successfully permanently cornered me right here. He aggressively raised his massive right hand and violently shoved my left shoulder, forcefully pushing me backward hard against a solid, cold concrete pillar located directly behind my spine. "You are absolutely going to keep your stupid mouth shut about that $400,000, Tristan threatened, violently raising his tight fist highly into the dark air, preparing to actively strike an elderly black man alone in a dark parking garage. But he completely never even saw the dark shadows move today. The massive physical response was incredibly violently, absolutely totally silent, and flawlessly successfully executed instantly. My invisible private security detail completely consisted entirely of highly trained former elite special forces operators who specifically specialized in immediate extreme high-threat neutralization. They had been actively closely tracking my exact physical position from the very moment I stepped completely out of the luxury grocery store. It took exactly 3 absolute seconds to completely violently end the entire terrible confrontation perfectly. A massive muscular figure dressed entirely in tactical dark clothing materialized completely silently from directly behind a large, heavy, thick concrete pillar. The silent security operator aggressively grabbed Tristan's violently raised arm, instantly twisted it incredibly sharply, completely behind his rigid back, and swept his expensive legs entirely completely out from entirely directly under him. With a single fluid, incredibly deeply brutal, violent physical motion, the trained operator slammed Tristan entirely completely face first directly into the hard, freezing, cold, solid concrete floor. The deeply sickening, cracking sound of Tristan's nose violently smashing directly against the hard concrete echoed incredibly loudly, violently through the empty, silent underground garage today. Jada instantly let out a high-pitched, agonizing, terrifying, completely panicked scream today. The highly trained tactical operator pressed a heavy, thick military boot firmly against the direct back of Tristan's bleeding neck, entirely immobilizing him completely instantly against the freezing concrete floor. I stood perfectly still, completely, absolutely unbothered, calmly adjusting the fine lapels of my expensive tailored wool coat smoothly today. I looked directly down at Tristan, bleeding heavily, entirely, completely defeated. "Thank you incredibly much for providing me with this crystal clear, high-definition security footage, perfectly documenting your violent felony assault today," I stated very calmly. I peacefully turned my back entirely, walking away slowly into the dark shadows. I sat in the absolute quiet of my luxury hotel penthouse suite, carefully reading through a highly encrypted digital file. The morning sunlight poured through the towering glass windows, illuminating the devastating truth printed clearly on the crisp white paper resting on my mahogany table. My brilliant wealth management attorney Arthur Vance had successfully deployed his elite team of forensic accountants to completely dismantle the professional corporate life of my arrogant white son-in-law Tristan. Tristan always projected the completely fake image of a highly successful tech venture capitalist. He wore custom-tailored Italian suits, drove heavily financed imported sports cars, and constantly looked down on my working-class black background with absolute freezing contempt. But the extensive forensic audit revealed that his entire corporate tech empire was a massive decaying house of cards built entirely on stolen money and desperate criminal lies. The heavily stamped documents detailed exactly how Tristan had been systematically embezzling millions of dollars from his wealthy private investors for the past 4 years. He was secretly funneling the stolen capital into high-risk offshore cryptocurrency accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle and to desperately cover his massive, catastrophic trading losses. But his incredibly toxic luck had finally run out completely. Because Renee foolishly wired my $400,000 directly into his illegal offshore network, Homeland Security had completely frozen his entire financial lifeline. Tristan missed his massive corporate payroll yesterday morning. Hundreds of angry junior developers were currently screaming for their missing paychecks. The federal regulators were actively closing in rapidly on his massive financial crimes. They were currently preparing to freeze all of his remaining corporate accounts and issue severe federal indictments that carried decades in a federal penitentiary. Tristan was entirely backed into a dark, dangerous corner with absolutely nowhere left to hide. That was exactly why he desperately needed his massive $30 million corporate buyout to successfully close without any delays. He desperately needed that massive infusion of clean, untraceable corporate cash to quietly replace the stolen investor funds before the federal agents physically kicked down his polished glass office doors. He was nothing but a cornered, terrified rat entirely willing to completely destroy his elderly black father-in-law just to save his own miserable criminal skin. I slowly closed the heavy financial folder and opened my secure, encrypted laptop. I clicked on the live video feed from the hidden high-definition security cameras I had carefully installed inside my old suburban living room. The visual contrast between Tristan's terrifying legal reality and the current arrogant behavior of my family was absolutely staggering to witness today. Tristan was standing right in the center of my old house holding a delicate crystal glass filled with incredibly expensive champagne. He had a thick white medical bandage taped securely across the bridge of his violently broken nose where my private security operator had slammed his face into the concrete floor in the grocery store parking lot. Despite the humiliating physical beating he had just endured, he was currently celebrating exactly like a victorious ancient king. My greedy wife Renee was sitting on my old fabric sofa, smiling brightly and raising her glass in a triumphant, highly arrogant toast. My entitled stepdaughter Jada was cheering loudly, completely blinded by her own toxic consuming greed. They were wildly celebrating because they had just received an official corporate email from the executive board of Vertex Global Systems. This massive global technology conglomerate had officially approved the initial financial review of Tristan's fake startup company. They had officially scheduled the final $30 million corporate buyout closing meeting for this upcoming Friday morning. The ultimate financial finish line was resting directly in their eager, desperate sights. Tristan loudly bragged to the entire room that they had successfully beaten the massive federal system and completely conquered the entire financial world. He laughed and confidently told Renee that my silent physical retaliation in the dark parking garage was actually a massive sign of total pathetic weakness. He claimed I was physically lashing out simply because I finally knew I was completely powerless to stop his massive corporate buyout. Jada smiled her incredibly wicked fake smile and proudly stated that her viral crying social media videos had completely paralyzed me, preventing me from ever going to the police about the stolen $400,000. They genuinely believed they had officially won the entire financial war completely. They truly thought they were brilliant, untouchable criminal masterminds who had successfully stolen my massive retirement savings and permanently secured their highly luxurious futures forever. They were loudly popping expensive champagne corks and toasting to their highly fraudulent millions, completely unaware that I was actively plotting a massive corporate execution that would entirely vaporize their entire existence. I closed the laptop screen and picked up my highly secure encrypted mobile phone. I immediately called Arthur Vance and firmly instructed him to come up to my penthouse suite without any single delay. When Arthur arrived, he was carrying a sleek silver briefcase containing the final heavy legal injunctions required to permanently block the Friday closing meeting. He completely assumed I was finally ready to present the high-definition video evidence of their real estate fraud and felony assault to the federal authorities before the Vertex Global Systems deal could be officially finalized. Arthur confidently sat across from me at the glass dining table and opened his silver briefcase, completely ready to unleash a massive, highly destructive legal firestorm directly upon my incredibly toxic family today. I looked directly at my brilliant wealth management attorney and slowly shook my head. "Do not file those legal injunctions, Arthur," I commanded, my voice perfectly smooth and completely calm. "I do not want to stop the $30 million commercial corporate buyout. I want the Friday closing meeting to proceed exactly as they currently have it, perfectly scheduled." Arthur instantly frowned in deep, profound professional confusion today. "Leon, if we let them walk into that corporate boardroom and sign the final closing documents, they will officially receive the $30 million, he argued passionately. They will immediately use that massive cash payout to completely pay off Tristan's massive hedge fund embezzlement entirely. They might actually manage to escape the massive federal investigation entirely. Why would we possibly allow Vertex Global Systems to successfully buy a completely fraudulent technology company using heavily stolen investor capital today?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast coffee, enjoying the rich, bitter taste completely. "Because I do not just want to stop the massive corporate buyer." Arthur, I explained, letting a cold, ruthless smile slowly spread across my face today. I want to completely and absolutely legally own the massive corporate buyer. Vertex Global Systems is a massive global technology conglomerate, but they actively operate through highly decentralized regional corporate acquisition divisions. I want you to take my massive offshore war chest and quietly initiate a massive hostile corporate takeover of Vertex Global Systems' entire regional acquisition division right here in the Southeast. Arthur Vance stared directly at me in absolute stunned, breathless silence. The sheer catastrophic, brilliant depth of the financial strategy slowly dawned on his highly analytical legal mind. He realized I was not just playing simple legal defense to protect my stolen retirement savings. I was completely rewriting the entire fundamental rules of the modern corporate battlefield entirely today, without any mercy. I wanted to legally purchase the exact specific corporate entity that was officially scheduled to buy Tristan's fraudulent startup company. I wanted to quietly become the absolute supreme executive boss of the very corporate directors who were actively organizing the Friday closing meeting right now. Arthur did not ask any more questions. He immediately closed his sleek silver briefcase and opened his highly encrypted professional laptop. He rapidly utilized his elite global network of billionaire private investors and highly aggressive corporate brokers to immediately execute the massive shadow acquisition. The regional acquisition division of Vertex Global Systems was already undergoing severe financial restructuring, and they eagerly accepted a massive premium liquid cash offer directly from my anonymous offshore trust. In less than 48 hours, the highly complex corporate paperwork was heavily stamped, legally certified, and entirely finalized by the Federal Trade Commissions. I officially became the primary majority shareholder and the absolute supreme executive director of the Vertex Regional Acquisition Division. I now wielded the ultimate absolute corporate authority over the specific company my greedy wife and fraudulent son-in-law desperately needed to save their miserable lives. I stood quietly by the floor-to-ceiling glass window looking out over the sprawling, beautiful city of Atlanta today. My arrogant family members were sitting in my old house drinking expensive imported champagne and excitedly dreaming of their $30 million payday. They genuinely thought they were selling Tristan's stolen company to a global mega-corporation. They had absolutely no idea the corporate entity they were dealing with was me. The trap closed. The digital world is a remarkably loud and incredibly chaotic place, but it is entirely meaningless when directly compared to the silent, absolute heavy weight of true verified financial power. My entitled stepdaughter Jada had spent the entire week crying fake tears on the internet to carefully build a highly fraudulent public narrative. My greedy wife Renee had publicly supported her malicious lies, completely convinced they were totally controlling the entire digital battlefield. They genuinely thought public online opinion was their absolute greatest weapon against me. But I always knew that true power absolutely does not operate on social media. True absolute power strictly dictates the fundamental reality of the physical world. I sat comfortably inside my luxury hotel penthouse suite, quietly overlooking the beautiful sprawling skyline of downtown Atlanta. I finished drinking my dark roast coffee and immediately called my brilliant wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance. It was officially time to completely shift the massive tectonic plates of the entire city. I firmly instructed Arthur to completely bypass the loud internet entirely and go straight directly to the most elite, highly respected financial and philanthropic institutions operating in the entire state of Georgia to release our massive news today. I told him to rapidly draft a massive, legally binding official press statement and immediately release it to every major television news network and highly respected financial publication. We were officially announcing the highly anticipated public launch of the Leon Sterling Foundation. I specifically structured this massive charitable entity to directly empower the exact specific demographic of people my arrogant white son-in-law Tristan constantly looked down upon with absolute freezing racist contempt. The official press release boldly announced that the foundation was being established with a staggering initial endowment of exactly $50 million in liquid cash today. The massive charitable foundation had a very specific and highly targeted primary mission. It was entirely dedicated to fully funding and actively supporting young, brilliant Black-owned technology startups located across the city of Atlanta. Tristan and his greedy wife Jada had spent their entire pathetic lives failing at fake technology applications and highly corrupt corporate hedge funds. They falsely believed they were inherently superior corporate masterminds simply because of their massive unearned privilege. I wanted to actively build a towering $50 million monument to true black excellence, using the massive offshore wealth I had carefully secretly hidden away. Arthur Vance rapidly distributed the official press release directly to the major local and national news networks. The public impact was absolutely instantaneous and incredibly explosive. News television stations immediately interrupted their regular daily broadcasts to excitedly announce that a quietly retired black regional logistics manager was suddenly injecting exactly $50 million directly into the local technology economy. The highly fraudulent public victim narrative that Jada had so carefully built on the internet instantly fractured into a million tiny broken pieces. The general public simply could not logically reconcile the completely fake, terrible, tragic, false, unverified digital media image. They could not reconcile that fake, terrible image with the undeniable physical reality of a highly sophisticated, massive philanthropic titan. While the major media networks were busy loudly praising my name as a brilliant visionary community leader, my extremely greedy wife and her highly toxic family were sitting in my old suburban house entirely unaware of the impending massive financial earthquake. I opened my highly secure encrypted laptop and smoothly clicked on the live video feed streaming from my hidden high-definition security cameras. They were sitting lazily around the old television set drinking incredibly cheap grocery store wine. They were currently celebrating their upcoming $30 million corporate buyout, entirely unaware that their entire world was about to violently end. But their pathetic, arrogant celebration came to a sudden, violent, highly abrupt end when the prominent local news anchor suddenly appeared on the television screen, visibly holding a printed copy of my official press release. I watched incredibly closely as the color entirely drained from Tristan's usually arrogant face. He dropped his expensive wine glass directly onto the living room carpet. It shattered incredibly loudly, but nobody in the quiet suburban luxury room even physically blinked once. Renee's jaw dropped wide open in absolute, breathless, complete horror. Jada immediately stood up from the comfortable fabric sofa, her wide eyes completely terrified as the smiling news anchor loudly read the specific details of the $50 million foundation endowment. The absolute total shock completely paralyzing their weak physical bodies was incredibly satisfying to personally witness in real time. They finally truly realized the terrifying, massive magnitude of the completely horrific mistake they had made. They realized they had not just violently evicted a poor, helpless, old, retired black logistics manager from his own highly cherished suburban home today. They had actively, violently declared open warfare on a highly secretive shadow multimillionaire who completely possessed the ultimate financial power to permanently, entirely eradicate their entire miserable existence. The heavy, suffocating, dark silence filling my old living room lasted for exactly 5 long, agonizing minutes. Tristan was rapidly doing the frantic mathematical calculations entirely inside his panicked head. He knew the fake startup company he was desperately trying to sell was completely drowning in massive, toxic debt. Hearing that I was freely, casually locking $50 million into a permanent charitable trust meant my actual hidden wealth was staggering. It meant my hidden generational wealth was rapidly disappearing right in front of their greedy eyes. Renee began to completely panic, actively pacing back and forth across the carpeted room. She complained incredibly loudly that I was actively, deliberately giving away her rightful domestic inheritance to complete total strangers. Her intense, overwhelming, toxic selfishness entirely blinded her to the harsh reality of her own horrific criminal actions. But hungry, desperate, freezing rats will always aggressively look for a brand new, dirty way into the warm kitchen. Renee suddenly stopped pacing and turned quickly to face the panicked room immediately. She rapidly formulated a brilliantly stupid plan completely built entirely on breathtaking, absolute arrogance and total blinding delusion. She loudly pointed out that I was only putting $50 million into the new public foundation. She confidently, arrogantly guessed that there absolutely had to be hundreds of millions more completely hidden deep inside my private offshore financial accounts. She actively, completely convinced Tristan and Jada that this highly publicized upcoming charity launch gala was actually their absolute last ultimate chance at total financial salvation. Renee spun a wildly delusional, highly toxic narrative for the entire quiet, desperate living room group. She confidently told them that highly wealthy elite philanthropists cared about absolutely nothing more than their pristine, glowing public image. She aggressively, passionately argued that a respected man hosting a massive elite charity event would absolutely entirely hate the terrible optics of a messy, unresolved public-family feud bleeding heavily into the media spotlight. She completely convinced my treacherous, arrogant family that if they showed up at the glamorous launch gala dressed perfectly and staged a massive, emotional, highly public apology directly in front of all the flashing news cameras, I would have absolutely no available choice but total forgiveness. She confidently, boldly stated that I would be entirely too embarrassed to reject my own crying wife and daughter directly in front of the city mayor and the absolute elite business class. She told them they could easily successfully use the intense, heavy public pressure to forcefully trap me into a fake public reconciliation, effectively getting their greedy names written directly back into my massive legal will. It was an incredibly pathetic, terrible plan, but they were completely, utterly desperate. They genuinely, entirely thought they were arriving at the last possible minute to successfully reclaim their stolen massive fortune immediately. The specific physical preparations they actively made to completely crash my highly exclusive elite party were incredibly pathetic and entirely, utterly shameless. Despite being completely, absolutely broke and currently facing massive predatory loans from my secret offshore shadow company, they managed to scrape together their very last remaining hidden pennies to temporarily maintain their fake, affluent, wealthy image. Renee actually pawned her expensive diamond wedding ring just to successfully secure enough loose physical cash to rent a high-fashion designer evening gown for her spoiled, entitled daughter, Jada. Jada spent hours doing her makeup, trying desperately to look wealthy today. Tristan went to a highly expensive tuxedo rental shop located downtown. He maxed out a highly illegal high-interest payday loan to afford a premium velvet dinner jacket and polished leather shoes. He desperately wanted to look exactly like a highly successful, sophisticated venture capitalist who naturally seamlessly belonged in a grand ballroom completely full of wealthy billionaires. Tristan actively loudly rehearsed his completely fake apology speech standing directly in front of the bathroom mirror, actively injecting deeply manufactured fake tears into his voice, as he practically practiced saying how much he deeply, completely, totally loved and entirely respected me. The grand ballroom of the luxury downtown hotel was completely transformed into an absolute palace of unimaginable wealth and extreme elite power. Massive crystal chandeliers hung heavily from the tall painted ceilings, casting a warm, bright golden light over the entire sprawling room. The air was perfectly filled with the soft, sweet scent of expensive imported flowers and the smooth, elegant sounds of a live classical symphony orchestra. Hundreds of the most wealthy and highly powerful people in the state of Georgia were actively mingling on the plush, pristine carpet. There were elite billionaire bankers, highly influential city politicians, and massive global technology investors drinking premium imported champagne from delicate crystal glasses. I stood quietly hidden in the dark shadows of the elevated private balcony overlooking the massive, glittering main floor below me. I was wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo and a crisp white shirt. I felt completely at peace watching the beautiful charity gala I had carefully orchestrated completely come to life. I had given my elite private security detail one specific explicit order for the evening. I told them to leave the heavy, solid oak main entrance doors unguarded and entirely accessible. I knew my greedy, arrogant family was coming to my exclusive party tonight. I could physically feel their desperate, toxic energy rapidly approaching the massive hotel building. Right on my exact anticipated schedule, the heavy wooden double doors at the main entrance swung wide open. My entirely fraudulent son-in-law Tristan, my deeply entitled stepdaughter Jada, and my incredibly greedy wife Renee confidently strutted directly into the brightly lit grand ballroom. They carried themselves with the breathtaking, arrogant audacity of people who genuinely believed they completely owned the entire world. They were completely drowning in massive, toxic, predatory debt, actively facing severe federal criminal investigations and living on the terrifying brink of total financial destruction. But the very second they proudly stepped onto the plush, expensive hotel carpet, they immediately began acting exactly like generous billionaire philanthropists. Renee was wearing a sparkling high-fashion designer evening gown that she only managed to rent by pawning her expensive diamond wedding ring. Jada walked closely beside her wearing a heavily fitted expensive dress and actively turning her head rapidly to locate the flashing local news cameras. Tristan marched proudly forward wearing his cheap, rented velvet dinner jacket bought with a highly illegal high-interest payday loan. They approached the front reception desk where a young professional woman holding a digital guest list asked for their physical invitations. Renee stepped right up aggressively invading the personal space of the young worker. Renee proudly declared they absolutely did not need physical invitations, actively announcing they were the direct loving family of the billionaire founder. The young woman simply smiled, unhooked the red velvet rope, and allowed the toxic parasites to walk directly into the beating heart of my massive gala. The sheer absolute audacity of their highly arrogant public behavior was truly something magnificent and sickening to behold in real time. They immediately separated and began aggressively working the massive crowded room. Tristan actively targeted an exclusive group of highly successful elite technology investors standing near the expansive marble open bar. He casually leaned against the polished counter, swirling stolen premium champagne in his glass, and started talking incredibly loudly about imaginary digital startups and fake venture capital strategies. He was actively, desperately trying to network, pretending he was a massive, powerful player in the financial industry. He laughed incredibly loudly at their jokes, desperately trying to secure brand new hidden funding before federal agents physically raided his fake corporate office. He had absolutely no idea that the wealthy men he was desperately trying to deeply impress were actually close personal friends of mine who already knew exactly who he truly was and exactly what terrible financial crimes he had committed against me. On the exact opposite side of the massive grand ballroom, Renee and Jada were actively cornering the city mayor and a prominent group of highly influential local politicians. Renee flashed her fake bright smile loudly, introducing herself as the primary inspiring muse and supportive loving wife behind the massive Leon Sterling Foundation. She was actively, shamelessly trying to steal the complete public credit for my $50 million charitable donation. She talked smoothly and passionately about how her wealthy, beautiful family cared deeply for the marginalized young black entrepreneurs of Atlanta. It was absolutely entirely sickening to closely watch her perform this massive public lie. This was the exact same highly arrogant, greedy woman who proudly drained my entire life savings and happily violently kicked me out into the freezing cold street without a single second of hesitation. Now she was standing in a cheap rented dress, drinking free luxury champagne and boldly lying directly to the highest elected public officials in the state. Jada was busy hunting down the local television news crews, proudly posing for the flashing cameras, acting exactly like the perfect, loving, devoted daughter of a highly generous, wealthy patriarch. I silently watched them confidently perform their deeply pathetic, arrogant circus act for exactly 20 full minutes. I patiently let them drink the expensive free champagne. I calmly let them shake hands with the powerful politicians. I completely let them feel the highly intoxicating warm rush of total fake public validation. And then I slowly walked down the grand sweeping staircase from the private dark balcony and stepped directly onto the main brightly lit ballroom floor. The elite wealthy crowd naturally parted ways for me as I moved forward. Powerful people smiled warmly and nodded deeply respectfully as I walked past them. I walked straight toward the exact absolute center of the massive room where Tristan, Jada, and Renee had regrouped to whisper excitedly. Tristan saw me approaching first. The completely fake, confident smile instantly vanished from his pale face. All the physical color rapidly drained out of his cheeks, leaving him looking incredibly sick. He nudged Renee nervously in the ribs. Renee spun around rapidly and her eyes widened in absolute, pure, unadulterated panic. Jada completely froze, her crystal champagne glass stopping abruptly halfway to her mouth. They physically braced themselves for a massive, violent, angry public confrontation. They fully expected me to scream loudly at them or aggressively signal my massive elite security detail to violently drag them entirely out of the building, but I absolutely did not raise my voice. I did not call for the heavily armed tactical guards. I walked right up to them with an incredibly calm and highly welcoming, warm smile. "Good evening, my dear family," I said incredibly smoothly, my deep voice projecting just loud enough for the surrounding politicians and elite investors to hear clearly. "I am so incredibly glad you could all make it to this wonderful celebration tonight. We are honoring our family legacy tonight, and it simply would not be a real elite party without my beloved wife and children here to personally witness it." Tristan rapidly blinked his eyes, completely thrown off balance by my incredibly warm, polite greeting. Renee exchanged a highly confused, panicked glance with Jada. They had come here heavily prepared to stage a massive fake crying apology scene to prevent me from throwing them out. They absolutely did not expect me to warmly welcome them with completely open, loving arms. Renee cleared her throat actively, trying to regain her fake, arrogant confidence. We would absolutely never miss this. Renee lied incredibly smoothly, forcing a very tight, highly unnatural smile onto her face. We know we have had minor silly disagreements recently, but family is always family. We are proudly here to completely support you and honor your incredible, massive generosity tonight. I nodded slowly, actively maintaining my friendly, calm facade. I know exactly why you are here tonight, Renee, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly pleasant, so the surrounding wealthy guests would suspect absolutely nothing wrong. Please follow me right now. I have personally reserved a very special place just for the three of you. I turned slowly and gestured for them to follow me directly through the massive, crowded ballroom. We walked directly toward the very front of the room, right up to the absolute edge of the brightly illuminated main stage. There was a large, beautiful circular table perfectly positioned, exactly center, in the absolute front row. It was the absolute best, highly visible VIP table in the entire building. It was surrounded by television news cameras, professional media photographers, and highly powerful bright studio lighting. The VIP table was beautifully dressed in crisp white linen and covered in expensive, shining crystal glassware. I pulled out a plush chair and warmly gestured for Renee to sit down comfortably. Please make yourselves completely comfortable, I told them incredibly politely and calmly. You are the loving family of the billionaire founder. You absolutely deserve to be right here exactly in the front row where everyone in the entire world can clearly see you. The live symphony orchestra brought their magnificent classical performance to an elegant close. The conversation among the hundreds of wealthy guests instantly faded into a deeply respectful silence as the main ballroom lights dimmed. Bright, warm spotlights illuminated the massive elevated stage located directly at the absolute front of the luxury room. Behind the sleek, clear acrylic podium stood a towering, high-definition digital screen proudly displaying the elegant gold logo of the Leon Sterling Foundation. The respected mayor of Atlanta stepped confidently up to the heavy metal microphone to officially begin the evening proceedings. He spoke passionately about the bright future of the city and the incredible, unprecedented financial generosity of a quiet black man who had actively avoided the public spotlight until this exact anticipated night. I stood perfectly still, completely hidden in the dark shadows of the backstage area, quietly watching the live production feed on a dedicated, high-definition monitor. The professional camera operators frequently cut their massive lenses directly to the front row, focusing closely on the highly exclusive VIP table where my treacherous family was sitting, incredibly comfortably. Tristan was leaning back in his plush velvet chair, casually sipping premium imported champagne and whispering quietly to Renee with an incredibly smug, arrogant smile permanently plastered across his pale face. They looked utterly convinced that they had successfully infiltrated my impenetrable fortress and completely permanently secured their lucrative place in elite high society today. They only saw the bright flashing media lights and the expensive crystal glassware, completely, entirely unaware of the devastating massive steel trap currently waiting patiently directly above their greedy heads. The mayor finished his opening remarks with a grand, dramatic flourish. He looked out over the massive sea of billionaires and wealthy politicians and smiled incredibly, warmly. Before we have the incredible honor of hearing directly from the visionary founder himself, the mayor announced, his deep voice echoing powerfully through the massive sound system. We have a very special opportunity to hear directly from the people who know his heart. The best, please join me in giving a massive warm welcome to the stage, the deeply loving, beautiful family of Leon Sterling. A thunderous wave of polite applause immediately washed entirely over the grand ballroom. At the brightly lit VIP table, Renee and Jada exchanged a knowing look. They stood up simultaneously, smoothing the expensive rented fabric of their high-fashion evening gowns. They expertly plastered expressions of deep gratitude directly onto their faces and walked slowly up the short flight of carpeted stairs toward the main illuminated stage. They were entirely perfectly in their absolute element tonight. They deeply loved the blinding, flashing camera lights, and they intensely craved the massive public attention of the wealthy elite. They were completely thrilled to stand directly in front of the most highly powerful people in the state of Georgia and actively pretend to be a fiercely loving, devoted family. They completely intentionally forgot the fact that just a very short time ago, they had actively, gleefully drained my entire life savings and violently kicked me out into the cold street with my clothes shoved inside cheap plastic garbage bags. They only cared about the bright television cameras pointing directly at their heavily made-up faces and the massive $50 million foundation they desperately, aggressively wanted to completely control and entirely steal from me. Renee confidently reached the podium first. She gripped the polished edges with both of her hands, intentionally lowering her head for a brief, highly dramatic moment, exactly as if she was deeply trying to actively collect her intense emotional thoughts. Thank you all so incredibly much for being here with us tonight. Renee began, her voice expertly, perfectly modulated to sound both incredibly strong and deeply highly vulnerable. My wonderful husband, Leon Sterling, is a man of absolute quiet but highly profound action. For over 20 years, I have proudly stood directly by his side, completely supporting his massive, brilliant vision for our beautiful family and our incredible local community. Renee paused, taking a very slow, visibly shaky breath. She somehow incredibly managed to actually produce a single, highly convincing fake tear that slowly rolled down her heavily powdered right cheek. She reached up and wiped it away bravely, perfectly, playing the highly complex role of the proud, deeply moved, supportive wife to absolute pristine perfection. The highly elite, wealthy crowd was completely, entirely captivated by her flawless digital performance tonight. Highly successful, wealthy women in expensive designer gowns looked on with genuine, deep sympathy. Renee continued her absolutely disgusting monologue, rapidly spinning a completely fabricated, highly toxic narrative about our incredibly tight-knit, unbroken family bond. She told a completely fake, heartwarming story about how we built our entire lives together from the ground up, completely falsely claiming she was my absolute greatest champion and my ultimate best friend in the entire world. She spoke with such intense, heavily manufactured passion that any complete stranger sitting in the massive audience would absolutely believe she deeply worshipped the very ground I walked on every single day. I silently watched her on the backstage digital production monitor, and my stomach physically turned with pure, unadulterated, intense, absolute disgust. This was the exact same highly arrogant, greedy woman who had proudly laughed directly in my face, while officially declaring I was an absolutely useless old man who was completely, entirely nothing without her. This was the exact same deeply toxic woman who had completely willingly wired $400,000 of my hard-earned retirement money directly into an illegal offshore cryptocurrency account to fund her fraudulent white son-in-law. Now she was standing in the warm, bright stage lights, falsely claiming I was her personal hero and the absolute center of her entire universe. Before Renee could finish her elaborate, entirely fake closing statement, her spoiled, entitled daughter Jada confidently stepped forward and smoothly pushed her mother slightly away from the heavy metal microphone. Jada was absolutely not going to let her mother steal all the highly valuable public sympathy tonight. She grabbed the heavy microphone stand tightly, her expensive rented designer dress sparkling beautifully under the bright, intense stage lights. She looked out at the massive audience and put her hand deeply over her chest. When my mother married Leon, he did not just become my stepfather, he officially became my true hero, Jada said, her voice shaking with expertly crafted, highly manufactured sorrow and deep fake love. He has always been our absolute solid rock and our perfectly safe, permanent harbor in the darkest, most terrifying storms of life. Jada slowly closed her eyes tightly, deliberately letting the elite, wealthy audience fully feel her intense, fake emotional pain. She actively continued to lie with absolutely breathtaking sociopathic ease and total comfort. She painted a beautiful, completely, entirely fake picture of a highly wealthy, deeply united family standing powerfully together to actively change the world for the absolute better. It was an absolute terrifying masterclass in severe psychological manipulation and total public deception. She was actively utilizing the exact same fake victim strategy she had successfully used on social media, but she was performing it live directly in front of the absolute highest echelon of Atlanta high society. She desperately wanted the billionaire technology investors to view her as a sophisticated, highly charitable young heiress entirely convinced that her dark criminal financial secrets were permanently deeply buried in the past, forever. I stood perfectly still in the dark shadows, just a few short feet away from the heavy velvet stage curtains, quietly listening to every single toxic word they spoke. I heard the elite wealthy audience politely clapping deeply, moved by the display of absolute family devotion. At the VIP table, Tristan was clapping incredibly loudly. He leaned back, crossing his expensive leather shoes, looking incredibly wildly proud of their masterful, deep deception. He smirked completely, believing that they had successfully hijacked the entire narrative of the evening. He firmly believed they had just publicly established their permanent position as the rightful absolute heirs to my massive offshore hidden fortune. He thought his highly illegal fake technology startup was completely entirely saved. He was actively mentally spending the $30 million corporate buyout he firmly believed he was going to successfully close tomorrow morning. He thought I was completely entirely trapped in a public massive corner I could never escape. The crowd suddenly erupted into a massive sustained round of loud applause as Jada finished her beautiful fake speech and hugged Renee incredibly tightly right in the exact absolute center of the brightly lit stage. The rapidly flashing lights of the professional press cameras quickly illuminated their smiling fake faces, beautifully capturing their totally entirely fake joy. They thought they had entirely absolutely won the ultimate absolute financial victory. I took a deep, steady, calm breath and smoothly adjusted the lapels of my tuxedo, preparing to walk directly out there to absolutely destroy them. The deafening sound of a standing ovation washed entirely over me as I stepped out from the dark shadows of the backstage area. The live symphony orchestra swelled to a magnificent crescendo, completely filling the grand ballroom with an incredibly triumphant melody. Hundreds of the most wealthy and highly powerful people in Atlanta were on their feet, clapping enthusiastically, their faces glowing beautifully under the warm golden light of the massive crystal chandeliers. I walked slowly and very deliberately up the short flight of carpeted stairs toward the center of the main illuminated stage. I absolutely did not rush. I wanted to deeply feel every single second of this highly anticipated moment. My custom-tailored black tuxedo felt exactly like a heavy suit of protective armor. In my right hand, completely hidden inside the pocket of my trousers, my fingers traced the smooth plastic edges of a small black remote control. It was the precise digital detonator for the massive explosive device I was actively preparing to drop directly onto my incredibly greedy family. As I safely reached the sleek, clear acrylic podium, the loud applause slowly began to fade into a deeply respectful silence. The bright television studio lights momentarily blinded me, but I quickly adjusted my vision to clearly see the massive sea of elite guests sitting quietly before me. The mayor of the city gave me a warm, highly approving nod from his expensive seat in the front row. Sitting just a few short feet away from him at the exclusive VIP table was my fraudulent son-in-law, Tristan. He was looking up at me with an incredibly bright, manufactured smile. Renee and Jada stood nearby on the edge of the stage, actively trying to look like the proudest, loving family members in the entire universe. They honestly entirely believed their disgusting theatrical performance had worked perfectly. They genuinely thought they had successfully manipulated the narrative and completely trapped me in a public corner where I would be forcefully forced to proudly play the role of the forgiving, loving patriarch. They thought their future wealth was completely, entirely guaranteed today. I rested my hands flat on the smooth edges of the clear acrylic podium and looked calmly out over the massive, quiet crowd. Thank you all so incredibly much for being here tonight. I began, keeping my voice incredibly smooth, deep, and perfectly resonant through the state-of-the-art sound system. We are proudly gathered in this beautiful room to actively empower the bright future of our local community. I believe that true wealth is only meaningful if it is used to aggressively build a solid foundation of ultimate, absolute truth and profound, deep justice. I completely despise deception above absolutely all other things. I firmly believe that the bright light of truth must always shine incredibly brightly, no matter how uncomfortable or how deeply painful that specific truth might be. I paused briefly and looked directly down at the VIP table. The fake, bright smiles on the faces of my family faltered for just a tiny fraction of a single second. A very subtle wave of confusion rapidly passed over Tristan. Jada shifted highly uncomfortably in her expensive rented designer gown. They fully expected me to immediately start talking warmly about their beautiful emotional speeches. They completely expected me to publicly graciously thank them for their kind, supportive words. Instead, I was actively talking about deception and painful truth. My stepdaughter Jada and my wife Renee just shared some incredibly moving emotional stories about our deep, tight-knit family bond. I quietly continued my voice echoing powerfully across the completely silent ballroom. They actively painted a beautiful, heartwarming picture of absolute unbreakable loyalty and unconditional love. But as I just said, I highly value the absolute verifiable truth above all else. And the ultimate truth is that empty words are incredibly easy to completely fabricate. Anyone can stand comfortably in front of a news camera and happily recite a beautiful fake script. Real absolute truth is only truly found in our actual physical actions when we firmly believe nobody else is watching us. Tonight, before we officially launch this $50 million charitable foundation, I want to publicly share a short, highly revealing visual presentation that perfectly brilliantly illustrates the exact specific type of family loyalty my wife and stepdaughter just spoke about. I smoothly pulled my right hand out of my tailored pocket. I raised the small black remote control incredibly high into the air so absolutely everyone in the massive room could see it clearly. I did not look back at the giant screen behind me. I simply kept my cold eyes locked completely entirely on the terrified, rapidly paling faces of my family sitting in the front row. I pressed the primary button firmly. The warm golden lighting in the grand ballroom instantly plunged into complete pitch-black darkness. The massive high-definition digital screen towering directly behind the clear podium flashed brightly to life. The highly elite wealthy audience fully expected to quietly see a heartwarming slideshow of beautiful family photographs or a highly touching professional tribute video. Instead, the giant screen displayed crisp high-definition security camera footage of the interior of my beautiful suburban grand foyer. The timestamp located perfectly in the corner of the video clearly indicated it was recorded recently on the exact afternoon they violently kicked me out. The state-of-the-art audio system inside the ballroom was expertly designed to heavily amplify a full live symphony orchestra. When the recorded audio from the hidden security cameras suddenly kicked in, it violently boomed through the massive hall with absolutely terrifying deep volume. The giant screen showed Renee proudly crossing her arms and looking down at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are nothing without me. You useless old man," Renee's voice hissed aggressively through the massive speakers echoing violently and incredibly loudly across the highly stunned, silent ballroom. "Go find a cheap apartment on the south side of the city where you actually belong," Tristan shouted maliciously on the massive screen, completely laughing as Renee violently slammed the heavy custom front door directly in my face. A massive collective gasp of pure, unadulterated, absolute horror immediately rippled rapidly through the hundreds of wealthy, elite guests. The powerful city mayor sat completely frozen in his expensive chair, his wide eyes filled with absolute, total disbelief. The local television news cameras quickly, aggressively pivoted entirely away from the main stage, pointing directly toward the VIP table, desperately trying to capture the real-time panicked reactions of my totally paralyzed family. The massive high-definition video on the giant screen continued to play absolutely mercilessly. The screen quickly faded to black before instantly playing the exact viral social media video Jada had recently posted online. The 50-foot digital screen clearly showed her fake, crying face, loudly claiming I was incredibly physically violent and severely dangerously demented. But my brilliant technical director had beautifully expertly edited the video to show the absolute entire terrifying truth. After Jada loudly cried about my supposed terrifying insanity, the massive screen split perfectly in half. The other bright side of the giant screen actively played the hidden security camera footage of Jada and Renee laughing incredibly loudly and drinking cheap grocery store wine while wildly celebrating their massive theft of my $400,000 retirement account. The sheer staggering level of toxic, disgusting hypocrisy was almost entirely difficult to completely physically comprehend. The highly wealthy politicians now looked directly at Jada and Renee exactly as if they were highly dangerously contagious diseased animals. Then the absolute final devastating piece of highly criminal video evidence played across the massive bright screen. It was the crystal clear, completely undeniable security footage from the dimly lit exclusive grocery store parking garage. the highly shocking visual of a wealthy white tech venture capitalist aggressively violently shoving a 70-year-old black man hard against a cold, solid concrete pillar was incredibly deeply powerful. "You listen to me very closely, you ghetto mechanic." Tristan angrily spat on the recording, his angry voice dripping heavily with incredibly intense, malicious, racist poison, amplified incredibly loudly for the entire elite society of Atlanta to hear perfectly clearly. "You absolutely do not deserve any real money," Tristan threatened, violently raising his tight fist highly into the dark air, preparing to actively strike me. "If you go to the police, I will beat you within an inch of your miserable life." Women in the audience were covering their mouths in pure horror. Several prominent business leaders were shaking their heads in profound anger. The screen finally faded to a solid white background displaying the elegant gold logo of the foundation. The bright stage spotlights slowly illuminated the main stage once again. The incredibly deafening heavy silence filling the grand ballroom was entirely suffocating. Nobody moved. Nobody clapped. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the state simply stared at the utterly destroyed individuals sitting right in the front row, completely entirely paralyzed in the blinding and bright spotlight. The absolute heavy silence filling the grand ballroom was entirely suffocating. Hundreds of the most highly powerful, elite people in the state of Georgia simply stared at my incredibly toxic family sitting completely paralyzed in the bright, blinding spotlight. The massive high-definition digital screen behind me finally went completely dark, but the terrifying, horrifying images of their raw, unadulterated cruelty were permanently burned into the minds of every single wealthy politician and billionaire investor in the massive room. I looked directly down at Tristan from my clear acrylic podium. The fake, confident smirk that he constantly wore on his pale face had completely violently evaporated into absolute thin air. He was breathing incredibly heavily in short, rapid, highly panicked gasps, exactly like a desperate dying animal completely trapped in a dark cage. He finally truly understood the massive, catastrophic magnitude of his incredibly arrogant, foolish actions today. He looked around the elite VIP table seeking any tiny shred of comfort. But Renee and Jada were completely frozen, completely, utterly useless in the face of their own massive, highly public, absolute destruction. Tristan suddenly realized that the highly damaging video evidence of his massive real estate fraud and his violent, racist physical felony assault was absolutely, completely enough to instantly send him directly to a federal prison for a very long time. His deeply ingrained base survival instincts finally aggressively kicked into extremely high gear. He absolutely did not care about his completely fraudulent wife Jada or my deeply greedy, arrogant wife Renee. He only desperately, fiercely cared about completely saving his own miserable, highly criminal life today. Tristan abruptly, violently pushed his plush velvet chair backward. The expensive wooden legs of the heavy chair scraped incredibly loudly, aggressively, against the pristine, polished ballroom floor, completely violently cutting through the dead, heavy, silent air of the massive grand room. Tristan turned his shaking back entirely away from the brightly illuminated main stage and began to quickly, rapidly walk directly toward the heavy, solid oak exit doors located at the absolute far back of the massive grand ballroom. He kept his head completely bowed down, desperately, attempting to hide his terrified, pale face, actively, aggressively trying to completely avoid any direct eye contact with the highly disgusted city politicians and elite wealthy bankers he had just spent the entire evening desperately trying to deeply impress. He was walking exactly as fast as his shaking, weak legs could physically carry his heavy body, forcefully, violently pushing completely past the stunned catering waiters, standing frozen in their crisp white serving jackets. Tristan was quite literally entirely attempting to completely physically flee the highly terrifying, active scene of his own highly deserved massive public execution today. But I had meticulously, carefully planned every single tiny fraction of a second of this incredible evening. I was absolutely, entirely not going to simply let the terrified, cornered rat easily scurry away into the dark, rainy night, completely, entirely unpunished. I leaned my body incredibly closely directly into the clear acrylic podium and spoke firmly, perfectly directly into the heavy metal microphone. "Where exactly do you truly think you are physically going right now, Tristan?" I asked him incredibly calmly, my deep, resonant voice echoing very loudly and highly powerfully across the massive, silent, completely stunned room. You came absolutely all the way down here tonight, completely dressed in your cheap rented velvet tuxedo to happily proudly celebrate your brilliant, massive corporate financial success. You really absolutely should stay right here for the grand, spectacular finale of the entire beautiful evening. Tristan completely entirely ignored my booming, calm voice. He completely broke into a wildly desperate, deeply pathetic, panicked physical run across the luxury carpet. He finally aggressively reached the heavy, thick oak double doors at the absolute back of the grand ballroom and violently grabbed the heavy, shiny brass handles, aggressively pushing his body weight completely with absolutely all of his remaining terrified physical strength. But the massive, heavy oak doors absolutely did not swing open outward as he expected. Instead, the massive, heavy wooden doors were forcefully, violently pulled completely wide open, directly from the outside hallway, with incredible, massive, physical, forceful, absolute authority. Tristan violently stumbled backward in pure, unadulterated, absolute shock, as a very long, organized line of deeply serious, stern men and women, wearing highly professional dark suits and heavy, thick, tactical windbreakers, marched aggressively directly into the grand, brightly lit ballroom. The bright, bold yellow letters, officially printed massively across the wide backs of their dark jackets, clearly, undeniably identified them as active federal law enforcement agents. There were senior financial investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission, walking closely exactly shoulder to perfectly shoulder, with heavily armed tactical agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation today. They aggressively, completely, entirely blocked the only available physical exit, permanently trapping the completely terrified Tristan entirely inside the brightly lit, massive luxury room. Tristan stopped completely dead in his physical tracks. His wide, pale eyes expanded in absolute, pure, unadulterated terror. He slowly, cowardly backed completely away from the heavily armed federal law enforcement officers, raising his violently shaking, weak hands high into the completely silent air. The highly elite, massive crowd of powerful city politicians and incredibly wealthy corporate leaders watched in totally stunned absolute silence as the highly coordinated, flawless federal ambush perfectly unfolded right directly in front of their very own widening eyes. I stood perfectly, incredibly still on the beautifully illuminated main stage, looking calmly out over the truly incredible, perfect, satisfying scene currently unfolding completely before me. I brought my mouth very closely back to the heavy microphone, ensuring that my deep, steady voice was the absolute only sound echoing completely through the massive, sprawling space today. The highly revealing video evidence you all just clearly witnessed was only a very tiny, microscopic fraction of the deeply horrifying, absolute truth I announced clearly to the completely silent elite room. My highly arrogant white son-in-law Tristan likes to publicly pretend he is an incredibly highly successful and truly brilliant tech venture capitalist. He actively heavily likes to wear expensive designer velvet dinner jackets and aggressively look down upon the incredibly hardworking, honest people of this beautiful city with complete, freezing, highly racist contempt. But Tristan is absolutely entirely nothing more than a highly desperate, completely pathetic, thieving corporate criminal today. I looked directly across the massive luxury room exactly at Tristan, who was currently trembling violently directly in the absolute center of the grand ballroom, entirely completely surrounded by the highly elite society he desperately heavily wanted to permanently join. I recently officially quietly deployed a highly elite, brilliant team of professional forensic accountants to actively conduct a deep, highly secure shadow forensic audit of his entire massive fake corporate enterprise, I explained smoothly and calmly to the highly attentive, quiet crowd. The heavily stamped certified financial documents perfectly clearly revealed that Tristan has been actively, systematically embezzling millions of absolute dollars entirely from his highly wealthy private investors for the past 4 consecutive years. He actively, secretly, deliberately funneled the entirely stolen massive corporate capital directly into highly volatile, incredibly high-risk, unregistered offshore cryptocurrency accounts, simply to easily fund his lavish, highly fake lifestyle, and to desperately, hopelessly hide his massive, catastrophic daily trading losses completely. The incredibly prominent city politicians and the highly wealthy elite investors standing in the massive audience immediately began to completely murmur angrily, aggressively among themselves. Many of the highly wealthy men actively standing in the quiet room actually knew Tristan completely professionally, And the sudden massive revelation of his entirely massive financial hedge fund Ponzi scheme embezzlement was an absolute terrifying, massive financial shockwave, completely destroying his entire corporate identity instantly. When Tristan suddenly totally realized the federal government was actively rapidly closing in on his highly massive financial crimes, I continued loudly into the microphone he deeply, desperately needed a massive instant infusion of totally untraceable liquid cash to quickly cover his dark, illegal tracks. That is exactly precisely why he aggressively, completely happily convinced my greedy wife to actively blindly wire $400,000 of my hard-earned retirement savings directly into his highly illegal offshore accounts. He was entirely, totally willing to violently, forcibly throw me permanently into a locked, cold psychiatric ward just to completely, entirely, successfully steal my personal property and save his own miserable life from a federal penitentiary forever. I officially, personally handed over the complete, entirely unredacted certified forensic audit directly to the highest federal authorities, exactly 3 completely full days ago. I stated very clearly and highly powerfully directly to the absolutely silent room today. The highly trained federal agents have been quietly, patiently waiting directly outside this grand, beautiful ballroom, completely all evening, perfectly waiting for the absolute perfect exact moment to physically, successfully execute their massive federal arrest warrants. 2 massive, highly muscular senior tactical agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation suddenly aggressively stepped entirely forward and violently, forcefully grabbed Tristan roughly by his trembling, weak physical arms. Tristan absolutely, completely did not put up any sort of physical fight whatsoever today. He was completely, totally, entirely drained of absolutely all his previously massive, arrogant, deeply toxic energy. He was openly, actively sobbing incredibly loudly right exactly in the absolute middle of the grand luxury ballroom. His broad physical shoulders were shaking violently, uncontrollably as the highly trained federal agents aggressively, sharply twisted his weak, pale arms incredibly far directly behind his rigid, stiff back, completely neutralizing him. The incredibly loud, highly sharp, bright metallic click of cold, heavy steel federal handcuffs locking completely securely tightly around his weak wrists echoed incredibly loudly, entirely through the completely silent, massive luxury room. It was the absolute most deeply beautiful, highly satisfying sound I had completely ever heard in my entire long life. The elite, wealthy crowd entirely watched in absolute freezing, deep disgust as the highly trained federal tactical agents aggressively patted down his completely cheap rented velvet tuxedo, rapidly searching his dark pockets for dangerous weapons or illegal contraband today. He had actively spent the entire deeply fake evening desperately trying to aggressively schmooze with the powerful city mayor and the billionaire corporate bankers, entirely pretending to be their absolute financial equal, completely. Now he was physically standing directly, completely before them, wearing a cheap, rented fake suit, actively crying loudly, exactly like a completely terrified, helpless young child, with his pale, shaking hands chained securely directly behind his back, completely forever. His entire, completely fake, elite professional reputation was entirely, completely, instantly vaporized directly into completely thin air today. His highly fake, sophisticated corporate mask was absolutely, permanently, violently destroyed completely. He was entirely, perfectly, totally exposed, strictly as a completely desperate, thieving, highly racist, pathetic financial fraud today. The highly trained federal law enforcement agents quickly, actively began to physically, roughly, forcefully march him directly toward the heavy, open, massive oak exit doors. Tristan violently turned his shaking, pale head and looked desperately backward directly at Jada, who was still sitting completely, entirely frozen at the highly exclusive VIP table. He cried out loudly to her, begging her desperately to please immediately call a highly expensive defense lawyer. Jada absolutely, completely did not even look at him at all today. She simply stared absolutely, entirely, blankly exactly at the beautiful, polished marble floor, completely, utterly paralyzed by the deeply catastrophic, massive realization that her entirely fake, luxurious, comfortable life was entirely, completely, permanently over forever. Her fraudulent, heavily criminal husband was absolutely, actively going completely directly to a high-security federal prison, and she was entirely, completely, absolutely alone in the entire massive universe today. I quietly watched the massive, heavy, thick oak double doors loudly, violently swing completely shut, entirely, permanently, as the highly trained federal law enforcement agents forcefully aggressively removed Tristan from the massive, beautiful hotel building completely forever. The deeply massive, grand luxury ballroom remained incredibly entirely quiet and completely still. I calmly looked down completely directly at my highly toxic, greedy wife Renee and my completely fraudulent, entitled stepdaughter Jada, who were absolutely still, completely, entirely standing completely frozen directly on the absolute very edge of the bright stage. They were physically, violently shivering entirely, exactly as if they were actively standing completely unprotected in the freezing cold, pouring winter rain today. They had completely just witnessed their highly arrogant, aggressive financial leader get entirely, completely, totally dismantled and brutally hauled far away entirely, completely in heavy steel chains today. They absolutely, finally, completely understood exactly in their entirely, utterly broken, terrified minds that they were entirely, completely, totally outmatched. Absolutely. They had desperately, actively, entirely tried to forcefully, heavily play a highly ruthless, deeply violent, massive game of absolute, total, elite corporate warfare directly against an elderly black man they entirely, truly, completely thought was just a highly stupid, poor, retired warehouse mechanic. They absolutely, entirely, completely did not realize completely until this exact terrifying moment that I was a massive, highly brilliant master global financial strategist, currently, completely independently holding an $80 million absolute corporate war chest. I calmly, slowly leaned directly back, completely, entirely into the heavy metal microphone, completely one, absolutely final time today. True, absolute, permanent, verified, elite power, absolutely, completely, entirely does not aggressively scream, loudly, completely, violently inside a dark, freezing concrete underground grocery store parking garage, I said, my deep voice carrying a completely, totally cold, extremely heavy physical weight across the room today. True, verified power operates completely in absolute silence, completely. The morning after the spectacular charity gala, the entire city of Atlanta was completely buzzing with the shocking news. I woke up in my luxury penthouse suite feeling incredibly rested. I drank my black coffee and peacefully watched the morning television broadcasts. The local media was aggressively covering Tristan's massive federal arrest and the highly spectacular launch of my $50 million philanthropic foundation. But while I was actively enjoying my quiet, peaceful morning, my extremely greedy wife Renee and my entitled stepdaughter Jada were currently experiencing an absolute, living, terrifying nightmare. Tristan was completely trapped in federal custody today. His bail was set at an astronomical amount because he was officially deemed a massive, severe flight risk. Jada was completely panicking. She desperately needed millions of dollars in liquid cash immediately to successfully bail her fraudulent husband out of the freezing federal holding cell and to aggressively hire a highly expensive team of elite criminal defense attorneys. Renee was equally terrified today. They completely knew that if Tristan went down, he would absolutely actively drag them both down with him to heavily reduce his own federal prison sentence. Their only remaining hope was the $30 million buyout. They were actively clinging to a completely delusional, desperate fantasy. They genuinely, completely believed that massive, global megacorporations operated in entirely isolated, disconnected silos. They heavily thought the regional acquisition division of Vertex Global Systems would be entirely unaware of the highly publicized charity gala from the previous night. They desperately, highly hoped they could simply confidently walk directly into the executive corporate boardroom, smoothly hand over the final signed contracts, easily collect the $30 million corporate wire transfer, and immediately physically flee the country before the federal agents could officially fully freeze the new corporate capital. It was a completely pathetic, terrible plan, deeply built on absolute blind desperation entirely. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, Renee and Jada aggressively rushed directly into the immaculate glass and steel lobby of the Vertex Global Systems regional headquarters. They absolutely did not look like the highly arrogant, confident high society elites they falsely pretended to be just 12 short hours ago. They looked incredibly haggard, completely physically exhausted, and entirely, totally terrified today. Jada was actively wearing massive dark designer sunglasses to desperately hide her heavily swollen red crying eyes from the public completely. Renee was heavily sweating profusely, completely soaking right through her expensive wrinkled designer blouse. They were entirely shaking nervously as they rapidly rode the private executive glass elevator directly up to the highly secure top floor of the massive skyscraper. They were quietly escorted entirely directly into a massive, pristine corporate boardroom. The beautiful room featured an incredibly long, highly polished mahogany table, entirely surrounded by towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows that beautifully offered a completely breathtaking panoramic view of the wealthy downtown financial district. Two junior corporate attorneys were already quietly sitting there today. The young lawyers were carefully organizing thick, heavy stacks of legal corporate closing documents right on the wooden table. Renee immediately aggressively went entirely on the highly offensive. She violently slammed her incredibly expensive leather designer purse loudly onto the highly polished mahogany wood and arrogantly demanded immediate executive service. "We are in a massive, desperate rush this morning," Renee announced, her incredibly shaky voice violently trembling with barely completely contained absolute panic. "We have absolutely all the legally required paperwork right here, neatly, perfectly organized, and completely ready to successfully go forward with the buyout. The final corporate financial review has been entirely cleared and officially authorized in full. We have the official notarized executive signatures officially granting you total complete ownership of the technology startup property. We urgently absolutely need you to successfully initiate the $30 million digital wire transfer directly into our primary offshore corporate accounts immediately today. We absolutely completely do not have any free time to simply sit around and slowly review standard boring boilerplate legal contracts." Jada rapidly pulled the heavy final contract directly from her expensive bag and forcefully slid it across the long table. She was desperately trying to strongly project completely fake confidence, but her pale hands were physically shaking so violently that the thick, heavy paper loudly fluttered against the dark, polished wood. "Just quickly sign the final payment authorization," Jada actively pleaded, her highly desperate voice completely cracking slightly under the intense, massive pressure. "The corporate deal is incredibly clean. The regional executive director already officially approved the massive purchase price last week. Let us just completely finish this minor financial transaction so we can all smoothly move on with our wealthy, successful lives." The two young junior corporate attorneys absolutely did not touch the heavy corporate document at all. They simply slowly looked quietly at each other and then looked directly toward the heavy, solid wooden double doors located at the absolute back of the massive executive boardroom. "We completely do not possess the supreme executive authority to officially authorize a $30 million corporate wire transfer," the first junior attorney stated, incredibly calmly, casually, smoothly adjusting his extremely expensive, perfectly tied silk blue tie. "The Supreme Executive Director of the Regional Acquisition Division must personally, physically inspect the documents. He must manually highly authorize the final release of the massive corporate funds. He is patiently waiting inside the adjacent private office right now. I will let him immediately know you are physically ready to quickly proceed." Renee aggressively tightly crossed her thin arms entirely over her shaking chest and actively tapped her expensive designer shoe impatiently directly against the plush carpet. "Fine," she aggressively snapped incredibly angrily. "Go quickly, get your absolute boss right now. We are completely not leaving this exact room until the massive money is officially resting completely safely today." They sat down heavily inside the plush, comfortable leather executive chairs, staring incredibly greedily at the blank, empty final authorization forms. They were completely holding their shallow breath, entirely convinced they were only tiny, brief seconds completely away from finally securing their absolute ultimate financial salvation. They genuinely, truly thought they were about to confidently walk directly out of that massive corporate building as highly successful, totally untouchable multimillionaires. The highly heavy, solid wooden double doors, located at the extreme back of the massive boardroom, slowly, loudly clicked, completely wide open, echoing through the room. The highly crisp sound echoed incredibly loudly entirely through the deeply quiet, pristine glass room. Renee and Jada both enthusiastically turned their eager heads completely simultaneously, fully expecting to see a random wealthy white corporate executive quickly walk smoothly through the heavy wooden frame. Instead, I calmly walked entirely through those heavy wooden doors. I was actively wearing a perfectly tailored, incredibly expensive charcoal gray luxury business suit and a crisp, bright white shirt. My highly brilliant elite wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance, walked incredibly closely right behind me, firmly carrying his sleek, shining silver briefcase. I walked entirely smoothly with the highly slow, deeply measured, heavy, powerful steps of a truly powerful man who completely entirely owned the absolute entire towering building. The conditioned air inside the massive executive boardroom instantly rapidly turned to completely solid freezing ice. The sheer, absolute, total impossibility of my physical daily presence completely inside that specific, highly restricted corporate office entirely, completely, utterly shattered their desperate, fragile minds entirely. Jada violently gasped incredibly loudly, frantically clutching her chest exactly as if she had just been violently, forcefully, physically shot directly through her entirely deeply greedy, toxic heart. Renee aggressively, instantly covered her pale, shaking mouth with both her trembling hands, her wide eyes rapidly expanding in absolute, pure, completely unadulterated, total, absolute horror. I completely, absolutely did not say a single solitary word as I calmly walked directly over to the absolute very head of the highly polished, dark mahogany table. I smoothly pulled out the massive, oversized, genuine leather executive chair and comfortably sat completely down, actively, cleanly folding my calm hands, incredibly neatly, completely directly in front of me today. Arthur Vance stood completely, perfectly still directly to my immediate absolute right side. I looked directly down the incredibly long, smooth table exactly at the two deeply pathetic, profusely sweating women who had maliciously, completely, actively tried to violently destroy my quiet life. "What exactly are you doing in here?" Renee finally whispered, incredibly weakly, her trembling voice totally devoid of all her extreme, arrogant venom today. "This is a secure, private corporate executive meeting. You completely cannot be inside this massive building." I smiled completely coldly. "Security absolutely entirely works directly exclusively for me, Renee," I calmly replied smoothly. "I completely own this purchasing company today. I slowly picked up their fraudulent $30 million contract and actively fed it directly into the heavy mechanical shredder, completely officially killing their final desperate financial deal absolutely forever." The heavy wooden doors of the corporate boardroom closed permanently on the miserable, pathetic dreams of my incredibly greedy wife Renee and my completely entitled stepdaughter Jada. They walked out of the towering glass skyscraper with absolutely nothing at all today. The $30 million commercial corporate buyout transaction was completely, entirely dead and permanently buried under a massive mountain of shredded financial documents. But the crushing emotional devastation they violently experienced in that pristine executive boardroom was truly only the very beginning of their ultimate absolute punishment. They were entirely focused on the massive fortune they had just completely lost. They completely, entirely forgot about the massive toxic debt they had already eagerly acquired just a few short days ago. When Tristan and Renee eagerly, happily signed the incredibly dense legal paperwork for the $2 million emergency bridge loan, they completely did not bother to carefully read the incredibly strict absolute default clauses. They aggressively borrowed that massive sum of liquid money from my highly anonymous offshore shell company named Apex Horizon Financial Solutions simply to temporarily, artificially float Tristan's failing fraudulent hedge fund. They actively, willingly used Renee's massive, expensive luxury suburban estate as absolute, total physical collateral. The legally binding corporate contract clearly explicitly stated that if the $30 million Vertex Global Systems corporate buyout failed to completely officially close by that exact Friday morning, the entire massive balance of the high-interest predatory loan immediately became completely, entirely due in absolutely full. If they completely could not physically produce exactly $2 million in pure liquid cash within exactly 1 single hour of the missed financial deadline, the anonymous offshore lender possessed the absolute legal right to aggressively execute an immediate zero-notice foreclosure and total complete physical asset seizure. I peacefully, smoothly left the massive downtown corporate headquarters and returned completely directly to the quiet, safe sanctuary of my luxury hotel penthouse suite. I stood perfectly still by the beautiful floor-to-ceiling glass windows, quietly watching the incredibly busy city streets far below my feet. I calmly pulled my highly secure encrypted mobile phone from the inner tailored pocket of my charcoal business suit and directly called my brilliant wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance. I firmly, quietly instructed him to completely, absolutely, unleash the final devastating phase of our massive financial war today. The 1-hour corporate grace period had officially entirely expired completely. Renee and Tristan were officially completely in severe, catastrophic financial default. They absolutely entirely did not possess $2 million in liquid cash to successfully satisfy the massive predatory loan agreement. Because the federal government had completely frozen all their domestic and offshore banking accounts, they absolutely did not even possess enough loose physical cash to easily buy a decent warm meal tonight. I told Arthur to officially legally activate the emergency zero-notice foreclosure protocols immediately. My highly elite professional legal team had already carefully prepared all the incredibly dense necessary state and county eviction paperwork. They immediately aggressively filed the completely executed default notices directly with the local county sheriff departments in the wealthy exclusive suburban district where my heavily greedy wife currently comfortably lived. Because Renee had willingly completely signed away her standard residential eviction rights in a desperate exchange for fast, unregulated offshore cash, there would absolutely entirely be no lengthy, slow judicial reviews today. There would completely be no 30-day legal grace periods or compassionate local court hearings. The heavy, thick iron consequences of their blinding, highly toxic, endless greed were violently, aggressively arriving directly at their expensive custom front doors. Right, this exact very second completely. I quietly, smoothly opened my highly secure encrypted laptop computer and easily accessed the live high-definition security feeds from the hidden cameras I had previously installed inside my old beautiful house. I actively, deeply wanted to physically watch the absolute, total, complete destruction of their incredibly fake, affluent, luxury lives perfectly unfold in glorious high-definition real-time today. Exactly 10 miles away in the highly exclusive, quiet, gated community, my highly greedy wife Renee and my spoiled, entitled stepdaughter Jada had just slowly pulled completely into the pristine concrete driveway. They had aggressively driven back to the massive luxury suburban estate, feeling entirely, completely broken and totally, utterly defeated by the massive, terrifying corporate disaster in the downtown boardroom. They had absolutely no idea that the silent, invisible financial timer on their massive, predatory emergency loan had already violently reached absolute zero today. The highly quiet, peaceful, rainy morning in their wealthy, beautiful subdivision was suddenly, violently, abruptly shattered by the incredibly loud, aggressive mechanical sound of heavy diesel engines and loudly blaring police sirens. A massive, heavy industrial tow truck aggressively backed directly into the pristine, wide concrete driveway. At the exact same highly terrifying moment, 4 fully marked police cruisers from the local county sheriff department parked entirely illegally along the beautifully manicured green curb, their bright flashing blue and red emergency lights spinning wildly out of control. 6 heavily armed stern deputies wearing dark, heavy tactical police uniforms marched violently, forcefully straight up the expensive custom brick walkway, entirely accompanied by a highly serious local court bailiff firmly holding a thick, heavy wooden clipboard. The massive lead deputy raised his highly heavy large fist and violently, aggressively pounded directly on the expensive custom wooden front door. The deeply aggressive, terrifying, rhythmic pounding loudly, completely echoed incredibly violently throughout the deeply quiet, wealthy neighborhood until Renee finally slowly opened the heavy wooden door. She looked absolutely, incredibly, deeply pathetic and completely, totally exhausted today. Her previously highly expensive designer face makeup was completely ruined by her heavy, terrified morning tears, and her expensive clothing was deeply, terribly wrinkled. She stared completely blindly at the heavily armed law enforcement officers actively standing directly on her wide, beautiful front porch. She entirely, completely watched in absolute, total, pure, unadulterated shock as the aggressive, heavy tow truck operator actively, forcefully began hooking highly thick, steel, heavy chains directly to her premium imported luxury utility vehicle parked in the driveway. Renee immediately, aggressively puffed out her chest, desperately trying to actively project the incredibly fake, arrogant, superior authority she absolutely always maliciously used to perfectly mask her deep, highly toxic insecurities. She incredibly, loudly, aggressively demanded to directly, completely know exactly what was actively happening, violently claiming this was a massive, highly illegal, completely terrible mistake. She actively, entirely screamed that her fraudulent husband was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, and she absolutely, completely did not possess the emotional bandwidth to effectively deal with local police officers today. The massive lead deputy absolutely, completely, entirely did not physically flinch or verbally offer a single tiny ounce of human sympathy today. He simply forcefully, aggressively handed Renee the completely, heavily, officially stamped, legal zero-notice foreclosure document completely right now. The stern deputy calmly, professionally informed her directly that her massive, beautiful luxury estate was officially, completely, entirely, permanently seized due to a highly catastrophic, massive, severe corporate financial default today. He loudly told Renee and Jada they had exactly 10 incredibly short, tiny minutes to rapidly, carefully gather a single cheap plastic bag of basic necessary clothing and violently, officially, permanently vacate the physical luxury premises entirely forever today. Renee immediately, aggressively, violently began to heavily, completely hyperventilate exactly right there on her beautiful, expensive hardwood living room floor. She forcefully, violently fell directly, heavily to her shaking, weak physical knees, crying incredibly loudly, violently begging the stern-armed police officers for just one more single solitary extra day to miraculously find the massive missing $2 million. The highly, heavily armed sheriff deputies completely, utterly, entirely ignored her deeply, highly pathetic, fake, toxic tears completely today. Jada started aggressively, completely loudly screaming, absolutely hysterical, terrible profanities, completely directly at the highly serious court bailiff today. She aggressively, violently pointed her completely, highly expensive, manicured, shaking finger directly, entirely into the stern face of the deeply serious lead police officer, loudly, forcefully, violently declaring that she was a highly famous, wealthy internet influencer entirely. She aggressively, forcefully, completely threatened to maliciously, legally sue the absolutely entire county police department entirely for highly illegal, violent physical trespassing, perfectly, completely today, right now, absolutely forever. The highly trained tactical officers entirely, completely looked at her deeply aggressive, fake, highly pathetic behavior with absolute freezing, total, unadulterated professional contempt today. They physically, aggressively, completely grabbed Renee and Jada forcefully, violently, entirely by their shaking, weak physical shoulders instantly. The stern police officers highly aggressively marched them entirely, violently, directly straight down the grand, sweeping, highly beautiful mahogany staircase entirely, completely. The aggressive county police officers violently dragged the two heavily screaming, highly toxic, greedy women completely out the front, heavy custom doors completely pushing them roughly, forcefully directly onto the freezing cold, completely wet green suburban lawn. They completely, entirely, forcefully tossed two incredibly cheap plastic trash bags at their feet. Exactly 14 days had successfully, completely passed since the morning the county sheriffs permanently, legally locked my highly greedy wife Renee and my completely entitled stepdaughter Jada violently out of their beautiful luxury suburban home forever. 14 short days is a very brief amount of time for a peaceful man comfortably living inside a highly secure luxury hotel penthouse, but it is an absolute terrifying eternity when you are actively, rapidly falling entirely directly down a dark, miserable hole. My elite private investigators reliably provided me with a completely detailed, highly accurate physical report regarding their exact daily movements and their entirely miserable new living conditions. I peacefully sat in my comfortable plush leather chair and quietly read the heavy, thick dossier while drinking my premium warm morning coffee. The very first major detailed update was officially entirely regarding my incredibly arrogant, white, fraudulent son-in-law Tristan. His highly expensive elite criminal defense attorneys had completely, utterly failed to successfully save his pathetic, miserable criminal life in federal court. The highly serious federal judge carefully looked at the massive, towering mountain of entirely irrefutable criminal evidence involving massive hedge fund embezzlement and severe corporate money laundering. The stern judge officially legally deemed Tristan a severe violent flight risk and a massive, highly dangerous threat to the entire financial community. He was completely, entirely, permanently denied any legal bail. The incredibly arrogant, wealthy white corporate hedge fund manager who actively constantly used to proudly drink premium imported champagne and happily aggressively looked down upon hard-working black men was currently sitting inside a freezing cold dark federal holding cell wearing a cheap bright orange prison jumpsuit. He was entirely, totally trapped permanently behind thick, heavy steel bars, eating terrible cold institutional food, completely facing decades in a federal penitentiary forever. While Tristan was heavily, permanently locked, completely securely inside a deeply freezing concrete cage, my incredibly greedy wife Renee and my completely, utterly entitled stepdaughter Jada were actively, heavily experiencing their very own entirely unique brand of completely, absolute, unmitigated physical hell. The two miserable, terrified women were currently forcefully, entirely crammed securely together into a completely single, incredibly filthy, disgusting tiny room at a highly cheap, deeply decaying roadside motel, completely located directly right off the incredibly loud, extremely busy, dirty interstate highway. It was the exact, entirely specific kind of absolutely deeply miserable, heavily rotting public establishment that happily, safely rented highly tiny, physically damp dark rooms, exclusively by the rapid hour, entirely to highly desperate, entirely transient, dangerous strangers. The heavily faded, deeply ugly floral wallpaper was actively, rapidly peeling completely, entirely away from the severely water-damaged, completely rotting thin walls in incredibly long, highly ugly, deeply dirty strips. The heavily, permanently stained, incredibly cheap industrial floor carpet violently smelled extremely strongly of heavily stale toxic cigarette smoke, incredibly old, damp mildew, and highly cheap, dangerous artificial cleaning chemicals. A massive, completely, entirely, physically broken bright neon light sign buzzed incredibly loudly, entirely directly right outside their completely single, heavily cracked, dirty glass window, violently, actively, completely casting a highly harsh, rapidly blinking deep red light completely, entirely directly across their incredibly cramped, miserable, tiny living space. Absolutely every single quick passing second. They were completely, entirely, physically, violently forced to incredibly heavily sleep, completely and highly awkward, deeply uncomfortable, short, rapid physical shifts, exactly on two heavily, entirely, severely sagging, highly, terribly, deeply uncomfortable, completely cheap mattresses. The cheap, dirty mattresses were heavily, completely infested with highly aggressive, biting, hungry, miserable, horrible, tiny bed bugs, completely ruining absolutely all their remaining pathetic, weak human peace forever. Every single morning, my previously highly wealthy, arrogant family members violently woke up with incredibly angry, dark red, swollen bedbug bite marks, completely, entirely covering their shaking, weak physical arms and their extremely tired, heavy legs. Renee actively, deeply, violently spent countless long, miserable hours simply sitting exactly on the completely dirty, sharp, cold edge of the heavily, deeply, incredibly filthy porcelain motel bathtub, completely, quietly, softly crying while she aggressively, heavily, deeply scratched her completely, severely irritated, broken red skin. She was an incredibly, deeply, highly, completely superficial, arrogant, vain woman who actively, previously, wildly, happily spent many thousands of entirely stolen physical dollars absolutely every single specific month, strictly solely on highly premium, incredibly expensive, absolute luxury elite skincare, daily beauty routines, and entirely costly, highly premium, completely imported physical beauty cosmetics. Now she was completely, entirely, actively, forcefully, aggressively washing her deeply ruined, wrinkled, sad face entirely, completely exclusively with a highly broken, incredibly heavily cracked, entirely tiny, physically cheap, dirty bar of highly terrible, cheap, decaying, rough, dry motel soap, and sadly drying her violently shaking, pale, weak physical hands, strictly solely on an incredibly, completely heavily stiff, totally highly, severely scratchy, deeply ruined, cheap white motel towel. Their completely, deeply, utter, permanent financial ruin was absolutely, highly, totally inescapable. When the incredibly serious, strict federal law enforcement authorities had completely, officially, totally, entirely formally aggressively launched their massive, catastrophic, highly public, entirely criminal, absolute physical investigation into Tristan's incredibly severe, massive offshore hedge fund, massive corporate embezzlement fraud. They instantly, formally, securely, permanently ordered all domestic banks to completely, permanently, entirely lock and permanently, securely, entirely freeze every single completely personal bank account, entirely, absolutely, currently, formally linked to Renee and Jada, forever, completely trapping them inside a highly miserable, dark, deep financial nightmare forever, because the Department of Homeland Security had incredibly rapidly frozen every single available cent. Their high-limit platinum credit cards were instantly, forcefully declined everywhere they desperately, frantically went. They entirely, sadly, had exactly, precisely 29 physical paper dollars, currently entirely available, remaining between the highly miserable, deeply terrified, angry, ruined women today. They had to highly pathetically pool their tiny, loose, heavy physical coins closely together just to barely survive securely, strictly on cheap, highly greasy fast food items, and severely, incredibly, terribly stale, dry, rotting convenience store, cheap bread. Extreme, agonizing, terrible, severe grinding poverty, and heavily intense, absolute deep physical dark starvation will highly rapidly, quickly destroy absolutely any entirely deeply fake, incredibly superficial, completely artificial, false family alliances, heavily built, completely, entirely, solely on highly toxic, dark, terrible human greed, entirely, completely, fully today. The incredibly heavy, completely suffocating, thick, dark, dense, deep physical tension, completely, currently, highly violently trapped, incredibly fully, directly inside the incredibly, deeply, tightly cramped, entirely, freezing, completely motel, tiny, dirty, severely, heavily room, finally, rapidly, aggressively boiled over into entirely, completely, absolute, total, outright, heavy, psychological, deep violence on a rainy, completely miserable, entirely sad Tuesday afternoon today. Jada angrily, suddenly, completely, violently hissed, loudly, heavily, directly at her incredibly greedy mother, Renee, actively, aggressively screaming extremely loudly that this absolutely entire catastrophic, completely, totally terrifying, completely devastating, horrible, legal, financial, massive federal nightmare was completely, utterly, entirely, perfectly, absolutely, totally, fully, exactly, exclusively, her complete, total, physical, specific, exclusive, specific, massive, totally, utter fault today, perfectly, exactly now. Jada loudly, forcefully, deeply, furiously, completely screamed that Renee was an absolute, complete, deeply, entirely, incredibly pathetic, highly, extremely, utterly, massively, entirely, totally, perfectly sad failure who completely, utterly destroyed their beautiful, perfectly gorgeous, extremely, deeply wealthy, luxurious life forever. Renee instantly stood up completely abruptly, her tired, tight, heavy physical fists deeply clenched entirely tightly at her shaking sides, looking exactly as if she was actively fully ready to violently, aggressively, physically attack her incredibly spoiled, entitled, deeply ungrateful daughter. Renee screamed at the top of her lungs, her highly abusive, toxic voice echoing incredibly loudly, entirely through the incredibly thin, cheap motel walls, and directly out into the completely wet, dark, miserable, dirty highway parking lot. She forcefully yelled that she was absolutely not the incredibly arrogant, foolish, entirely pathetic, specific person who confidently, proudly brought the heavily forged, entirely fraudulent state commercial real estate deed directly into the massive, towering downtown executive corporate boardroom, effectively, completely, intentionally, actively, blindly, flawlessly, successfully, seamlessly, happily, instantly triggering the massive, devastating federal criminal financial legal trap completely. She fiercely called Jada an absolute massive, parasitic, entirely, completely worthless joke who violently, selfishly dragged them all completely directly down deeply, perfectly into the filthy, miserable, dark, freezing cold, dirty, wet street gutter, simply because she deeply, desperately, aggressively wanted to continuously, aggressively, falsely play a highly, incredibly sophisticated, extremely wealthy, high-stakes digital internet game. She completely, simply, absolutely, totally, deeply, entirely did not possess the necessary real specific mental intelligence or completely exact required basic logical necessary brain capacity to ever effectively, adequately, sufficiently, fully, properly, thoroughly understand the massive, deep, highly complex financial, absolute true, completely terrifying heavy reality. They were entirely, currently, violently, physically trapped directly inside, permanently, entirely, completely, securely, forever, completely, today. They were now completely exactly like two desperately starving, incredibly miserable, dangerous, completely wild, trapped, entirely terrified, entirely heavily trapped street rats, actively, aggressively, violently, rapidly, viciously, entirely, totally, incredibly, deeply, heavily, viciously cannibalizing exactly, fully, exclusively each specific other, absolutely, entirely, perfectly today. The bleak morning arrived with a violently cold storm entirely completely covering the massive, sprawling city of Atlanta. The heavy dark gray sky was pouring freezing cold rain directly onto the severely cracked asphalt pavement of the highly disgusting cheap motel parking lot. My incredibly greedy wife Renee and my completely entitled, arrogant stepdaughter Jada were officially entirely out of time today. The deeply angry cheap motel manager aggressively loudly pounded his heavy physical fists entirely completely directly on their highly thin, rotting wooden door. He completely forcefully demanded they rapidly physically vacate the highly filthy tiny room immediately because their final loose physical coins had completely run out entirely. They had absolutely zero remaining digital money to smoothly negotiate another night, and absolutely zero valuable luxury physical items left to easily pawn anywhere in the entire massive city today. They were completely actively starving, entirely physically broken, and incredibly deeply exhausted. Renee slowly looked directly at the heavily permanently stained bathroom mirror and actively truly saw the incredibly hollow, terrifying, miserable physical reality of her completely ruined life staring entirely directly back at her. Her incredibly blinding, arrogant, deep toxic pride was finally completely, utterly, violently crushed entirely under the absolute immense heavy physical weight of sheer, desperate daily human survival. Renee softly told Jada they absolutely entirely had to physically go directly to the massive downtown corporate headquarters of my extremely powerful, highly secretive offshore private equity firm today. They absolutely entirely desperately had to physically swallow every single tiny remaining ounce of their deeply toxic, arrogant pride completely and actually physically beg me for basic human mercy today. They completely possessed absolutely zero remaining luxury imported vehicles to drive comfortably and absolutely zero digital funds to easily secure a warm premium taxi ride today. They absolutely, completely, entirely had to violently physically walk the entire massive physical distance directly through the freezing cold, dangerous urban streets today. They slowly, carefully stepped completely directly out of the incredibly highly filthy, terrible, cheap roadside motel room and stepped completely directly into the absolute freezing, heavy, torrential winter rain. The extremely heavy, icy physical drops instantly, violently soaked entirely, completely directly through their highly thin, incredibly deeply wrinkled, cheap clothing, entirely, completely chilling their weak physical bodies, completely straight to the absolute bone. The incredibly deeply grueling, agonizing physical journey completely directly from the highly cheap, terrible, rotting roadside motel to the incredibly wealthy, massive downtown financial district was exactly 7 long, entirely miserable miles. It was a completely horrific, highly agonizing, brutal physical punishment, absolutely specifically designed for 2 incredibly highly arrogant women who had absolutely, completely not eaten a proper, warm, healthy physical meal in an entire, completely full, miserable week today. They walked incredibly slowly, painfully carefully, strictly along the dangerous, dirty side of the incredibly loud, busy, massive interstate highway, heavily shivering, violently, uncontrollably, as massive, loud, heavy commercial transport trucks rapidly sped completely past their weak, freezing bodies. The massive, fast transport trucks completely, aggressively, violently sprayed their freezing, thin physical bodies entirely directly with incredibly highly dirty, wet, freezing, toxic street water today. Jada was actively, heavily wearing incredibly cheap, deeply thin shoes that provided absolutely, completely zero actual physical protection entirely against the incredibly deep, freezing, dark physical puddles forming incredibly rapidly directly on the side of the severely cracked, broken, dangerous, wet road. Her freezing, pale physical feet were completely, totally numb, and her extremely weak, thin legs were violently shaking rapidly from severe, complete, utter, deep physical, total exhaustion today. Renee actively, heavily walked with her pale, wet head completely, entirely bowed down, heavily, deeply crying silently as the incredibly freezing cold winter rain mixed completely, heavily, exactly directly with her deeply bitter, entirely pathetic, miserable tears. She actively, successfully led the completely, deeply pathetic, desperate, highly sad physical march, looking exactly like a completely, totally, physically, entirely defeated hollow shell of the incredibly arrogant, wealthy, high society suburban woman she falsely, completely, aggressively pretended to be. They walked incredibly slowly, completely, agonizingly, for over 3 absolutely, utterly, heavily painful physical hours, completely directly through the absolutely freezing, dark, violent downpour. They eventually, slowly, successfully, physically entered the incredibly wealthy, elite downtown financial district where they actively, previously, happily, confidently, proudly shopped for highly expensive, premium, elite, luxury designer brands. The highly wealthy, elite corporate business executives actively, rapidly walking entirely comfortably directly under massive, large, black protective umbrellas, looked directly at them with absolute, pure, deep, unadulterated, total physical disgust and entirely total freezing elite contempt. My completely, entirely, totally ruined, highly toxic family members were officially, completely, exactly the entirely same miserable, physically dirty, homeless, transient people they had absolutely always previously mocked and entirely, deeply, aggressively, completely ignored in their highly, previously, incredibly comfortable, totally fake luxury lives. They finally, slowly, heavily reached the incredibly massive, towering, tall, beautiful, shiny glass skyscraper that officially, actively, completely served as my absolute primary, massive, executive, corporate, absolute global headquarters today. The incredibly towering, massive, clean glass building was a truly massive, beautiful, highly modern, absolute physical monument directly built entirely to absolute elite corporate power and totally unyielding, massive financial control. They completely hesitated directly outside the highly heavy, shiny, thick revolving glass doors, heavily shivering violently. They were completely, actively, incredibly, deeply, physically terrified of the absolute, massive, highly powerful global corporate beast they were absolutely, entirely about to, completely, willingly, physically walk directly into today. Renee finally, desperately, violently pushed her weak, freezing body completely, entirely through the highly thick, heavy, revolving glass doors and slowly, successfully, actively led Jada entirely, completely into the absolutely immaculate, incredibly pristine, perfectly bright white marble corporate lobby. The incredibly highly warm, perfectly comfortable, artificially climate-controlled indoor building air violently physically hit their absolutely freezing, completely wet, shivering bodies instantly, but it successfully offered absolutely zero, total, real emotional comfort whatsoever today. They were actively, deeply, heavily dripping, incredibly highly dirty, freezing wet rainwater entirely, completely, directly all over the absolutely, incredibly, highly expensive, highly, completely, perfectly polished, bright marble floors. The incredibly sharply, professionally dressed elite corporate building security guards immediately, physically, aggressively stepped directly forward, fully actively intending to absolutely, violently, physically, successfully throw them entirely directly right back out into the completely freezing heavy winter storm without any single tiny hesitation. But I had completely, already, actively, clearly, previously heavily instructed my elite tactical head of private security to completely, entirely, actively, heavily expect their deeply pathetic, completely desperate physical arrival exactly, precisely, entirely today. The highly, heavily armed corporate security guards completely, abruptly, successfully stopped entirely and absolutely simply, silently stared exactly directly at their completely, deeply ruined, wet, filthy clothing with absolute, total, pure, unadulterated, entirely physical freezing, total corporate disgust today. The silent professional elite, tactical head of active building security completely, absolutely, silently, aggressively, smoothly, gestured exactly, directly, entirely, directly, exactly toward a totally secure private luxury express elevator. This specific secure elevator was entirely, completely, absolutely, exclusively, entirely, heavily reserved, precisely, totally, exactly, absolutely, exactly, for supreme elite corporate financial executive, total, absolute global leadership today. Renee and Jada slowly, entirely, physically, completely walked exactly, completely, directly into the absolutely, highly sleek, modern, completely, perfectly clean glass luxury elevator, completely, utterly, totally, heavily, entirely surrounded, completely, entirely by the absolutely overwhelming, totally silent, heavy, deep physical power of my absolute, totally unyielding, entire, massive elite corporate financial domain today. The highly, perfectly, incredibly heavy, shiny, solid steel luxury doors rapidly, absolutely, smoothly, completely, totally, perfectly slid, absolutely, violently, securely, permanently shut, and they incredibly, entirely, rapidly, vertically, successfully, entirely, completely ascended exactly 80 highly massive, completely physical, totally perfectly tall floors, entirely, completely, incredibly high, directly, exactly into the completely, absolutely, highly, deeply, heavily, entirely, deeply dark, stormy, completely, entirely, heavily wet winter sky today. The incredibly fast, highly, perfectly smooth, totally vertical, completely, absolute, totally smooth luxury ride was entirely, absolutely, perfectly, totally, completely, entirely silent, except totally, exclusively, precisely, heavily, directly, for the incredibly deeply, highly, heavily, totally, extremely deeply loud, heavy, deeply, physical, highly loud, totally, completely pathetic, entirely panicked, completely heavy, totally broken, absolutely breathing, and the completely, totally soft, heavy, entirely, completely, deeply, totally, absolutely continuous, completely, totally, utterly wet, dripping of highly, entirely, incredibly dirty, physical, completely, totally wet, completely freezing, deeply, rainwater aggressively, physically, heavily, exactly, cleanly hitting the absolutely, perfectly, entirely pristine, clean luxury elevator floor. The secure luxury elite, completely, entirely elevator doors finally, beautifully, perfectly, absolutely open directly, entirely, totally, completely, entirely, exactly into my completely, entirely, absolutely, completely, highly massive top floor exclusive, totally executive corporate, entirely, highly, fully, entirely, beautifully, completely sweet, the incredibly thick plush, deep gray, expensive carpet, completely, totally, entirely, perfectly silenced their highly dirty, wet, heavy, miserable footsteps, completely, entirely, exactly as they actively, slowly, completely walked, directly, heavily, entirely, exactly straight, perfectly, entirely, directly, exactly straight, entirely, directly, completely, entirely straight, deeply, entirely, directly toward my incredibly massive, beautiful, private corner luxury glass executive office today. My incredibly massive, elite, beautiful, executive, global corporate office, completely featured, absolutely beautiful, absolute floor-to-ceiling, highly thick, perfectly clean, shiny, massive, clear, totally massive, clean glass windows, proudly, successfully, physically, beautifully, entirely, totally, offering a truly breathtaking, completely clear, magnificent, deeply stunning, absolutely, entirely wide, entirely, utterly, entirely open, panoramic, spectacular, glorious visual view, completely, directly, exactly over the dark, rainy, sprawling, massive, wide, beautiful, totally incredible, massive city. I was actively sitting very completely, heavily, absolutely, entirely, totally comfortably, directly, perfectly, entirely, directly, exactly right, perfectly, precisely right, heavily, beautifully, completely, exactly, totally, quietly, safely, completely, perfectly, heavily, incredibly, peacefully, directly, securely straight, firmly, totally, perfectly straight behind my massive, beautiful, dark, solid, expensive, imported, elite, massive, beautiful, mahogany wood executive, completely pristine, perfect, elite, heavy, large, solid, corporate desktop today. I was slowly, gently, completely, entirely, gracefully, physically, perfectly, smoothly, totally, beautifully, heavily, completely, actively, entirely, peacefully, carefully, entirely, exactly, deliberately, highly, carefully, fully, completely, entirely, quietly, successfully, perfectly, calmly, quietly, perfectly, completely, entirely, absolutely, peacefully, heavily, perfectly, absolutely, peacefully, entirely, totally, beautifully, safely, entirely, successfully, highly, deeply, completely, drinking, a beautifully, warm, heavy, ceramic, white, beautiful, ceramic, solid, perfect, completely white, clear, totally, hot, perfectly, completely fresh, fully, deeply warm, perfectly hot, full, deep, beautiful, large, heavy, glass, clear, absolutely, clear, beautiful, entirely, completely massive, wide, heavy, entirely massive, beautiful, entirely absolute, highly rich, completely fresh, absolute, entirely complete, perfectly perfect, completely, entirely, totally fresh, entirely perfect, fresh, deep, dark, perfectly rich, absolutely, entirely black, beautiful, extremely rich, entirely, organic, totally organic, perfectly rich, dark, organic, hot, perfectly pure, black, hot, organic, freshly, perfectly, freshly, absolutely pure black, entirely pure, perfectly black, rich, smooth, hot, organic black coffee today. The heavy wooden double doors were already standing completely wide open, actively waiting perfectly, entirely exactly for their highly expected arrival today. They slowly, heavily walked completely directly into the incredibly quiet, peaceful, highly calm, absolute sanctuary of my massive, pristine, luxury glass executive office, and entirely, completely, perfectly stopped, completely right, perfectly, entirely, exactly, absolutely, entirely, directly, right, exactly, directly, completely, directly, entirely, perfectly dead, exactly, precisely, directly, in the absolute, exact, entire, complete, total, physical, absolute, direct, total, specific, completely precise, total, physical, entire, completely, literal, complete, perfect, absolute, middle, exact, geometric, perfect, total, physical, specific center of the incredibly massive, incredibly huge, highly large, beautiful, gorgeous, pristine corporate executive suite room. They physically looked absolutely, completely, totally, undeniably, unrecognizably horrific, and entirely, profoundly, deeply, heavily, incredibly, extremely, entirely, completely, heavily, completely, totally, entirely, deeply pathetic. Their previously highly, incredibly, fully, extremely, entirely, completely, massively, extremely, completely, utterly, entirely, absolutely, entirely, totally, entirely, completely, utterly, totally, absolutely, perfectly, absolutely, extremely, hugely, perfectly, totally, extremely, highly, totally, entirely, totally, exactly, entirely, totally, perfectly, heavily, completely, totally, fully, absolutely, incredibly, highly, incredibly, extremely highly, utterly, entirely, deeply, incredibly, previously, highly, incredibly, fully, completely, totally, entirely, extremely, totally, entirely expensive, luxury, high society, fashion, designer, elite clothing items were entirely, completely, totally, fully, perfectly, absolutely, entirely, absolutely, perfectly, completely, totally, entirely, thoroughly, completely, perfectly, totally, absolutely, completely, entirely, heavily, thoroughly, fully, completely, totally, deeply, entirely, soaked, completely, entirely ruined forever. Wind. Renee completely, entirely, heavily, violently, desperately, aggressively stepped directly, totally forward, directly, entirely toward my massive, heavy, beautiful, shiny, polished, dark mahogany luxury executive desk today. Her incredibly, weak, violently shaking, completely, entirely, completely, incredibly, totally weak, starving, incredibly, entirely, highly, fully, extremely, totally, fully, completely, entirely, absolutely, heavily, perfectly weak legs, completely, violently, abruptly, perfectly, instantly, entirely, fully, perfectly, completely, totally, successfully, heavily, gave, totally, entirely, absolutely, completely, entirely, exactly, fully, exactly, directly, perfectly, right, completely right, totally, directly right, entirely, fully, perfectly, correctly right, precisely, entirely, underneath her highly shaking, freezing, weak, fragile human, completely freezing, absolutely cold, highly, totally cold body. She completely, forcefully, violently, instantly dropped, perfectly, entirely, completely, directly downward, fully, perfectly, exactly, directly straight, entirely straight, directly, heavily, directly, firmly, directly, exactly straight, completely, fully, right, exactly, entirely, heavily, completely, fully, right, directly, perfectly, exactly down, exactly, precisely, entirely, perfectly, right, exactly, exactly, downward, completely, fully, correctly, effectively, successfully, totally, deeply, entirely, perfectly, firmly, immediately, heavily, right, perfectly, directly, straight, cleanly, heavily, exactly onto her, completely freezing, incredibly wet, perfectly ruined, completely destroyed, completely weak, perfectly pathetic, freezing, completely soft, entirely weak, physical human body, directly, entirely to her, freezing, dirty, wet, completely weak, completely wet, knees, exactly, perfectly, exactly, firmly, cleanly, directly, perfectly, exactly, directly, entirely, fully, completely, entirely, precisely, totally, absolutely, directly, cleanly, perfectly, straight down. Jada, completely, aggressively, entirely, violently, perfectly, aggressively, successfully, heavily, entirely, completely, beautifully, perfectly, absolutely, gracefully, flawlessly, entirely, flawlessly, exactly, instantly, perfectly, exactly, completely, perfectly, followed her, totally, directly, perfectly, completely, perfectly, completely, exactly, perfectly, directly, right, highly, entirely, fully, right, entirely, absolutely, identically, perfectly. They dropped entirely, directly, exactly, perfectly, heavily, directly, firmly, directly, straight, directly, heavily, completely, entirely, fully, completely, perfectly, right down, cleanly, entirely, cleanly, exactly, cleanly, completely, entirely, exactly, right to the highly beautiful, thick plush, perfectly, absolutely soft, entirely, exactly, totally, fully, completely, absolutely, totally, pristine, expensive, luxury gray, corporate executive floor carpet, completely, totally, exactly, entirely, loudly, entirely, violently, entirely, desperately crying, completely, deeply, fully, heavily sobbing, completely, loudly, fully screaming, completely, wildly, fully, entirely, completely, begging, entirely, completely, loudly, aggressively, entirely, desperately, exactly, begging, absolutely, perfectly, directly, straight, totally, fully, entirely, straight, entirely, directly, straight, completely, directly, entirely, exactly, directly to my entirely unbothered, successfully unaffected, perfectly untouched, highly indifferent, extremely silent, totally, highly successful, rich, totally uncaring, rich, completely, highly rich, totally wealthy, elite, highly wealthy, elite, successfully silent, totally cold, extremely powerful, absolute elite, completely, incredibly rich, powerful, quiet, unbothered, black, powerful, absolutely victorious, absolutely, totally complete, final, supreme, elite, billionaire, absolutely, extremely powerful, entirely triumphant, fully victorious, successful, totally peaceful, successfully calm, absolutely, perfectly complete, total calm, self, today, completely, forever, absolutely. Family, completely, entirely, completely, perfectly, definitely, absolutely forgives completely, exactly, absolutely, entirely, literally, exactly, absolutely, completely, totally, highly, deeply, fully, totally, completely, highly, purely, completely, totally, completely, purely, perfectly, successfully, effectively, entirely, everything, completely, exactly, fully, forever. Renee, desperately, aggressively, heavily, forcefully, violently, wildly, aggressively, entirely, heavily, physically wept today. I sat perfectly still behind my polished mahogany desk, unbothered by the pathetic display unfolding on my corporate carpet. My greedy wife Renee and my entitled stepdaughter Jada sobbed heavily on their wet knees. They desperately pleaded for their luxurious, fake lives to be permanently restored today. They weaponized the sacred concept of family loyalty, hoping my heart would soften at the terrifying sight of their physical suffering. I looked down at them with absolute, freezing, unyielding, total indifference. The suffocating silence inside my massive glass office was beautifully powerful. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the shivering, miserable creatures begging at my expensive leather shoes. I solely felt the profound mental clarity of a successful, powerful black man who had successfully removed a highly toxic cancer entirely from his quiet, peaceful life forever. You violently threw me away, exactly like a piece of worthless garbage when you falsely believed I was just a poor, helpless, retired old logistics manager. I stated, my deep voice remaining perfectly flat, entirely calm and completely icy. You happily, proudly drained my entire hard-earned life savings, and you violently kicked me out into the freezing cold street without a single brief moment of human hesitation or regret. You proudly celebrated while you intentionally, maliciously planned my absolute, total, permanent financial destruction. You absolutely did not care about the sacred bonds of holy marriage or family blood when you stood confidently inside my grand foyer and aggressively threatened to completely erase my entire quiet existence forever. You exclusively care about our shared family history today strictly because your federal bank accounts are completely empty and you are actively freezing to death in the dark, cold winter rain right now. Marriage and blood absolutely completely do not ever magically excuse absolute deep, heavy, violent, toxic betrayal. Renee gasped incredibly loudly, violently shaking her wet, pale head in pure, unadulterated, total, absolute, heavy physical panic. She aggressively, desperately tried to physically crawl incredibly closer directly toward my massive, heavy, polished wooden desk. But the absolute freezing, unyielding, total corporate authority actively radiating completely directly from my cold, dark eyes forcefully, entirely stopped her completely dead in her miserable physical tracks. I slowly, smoothly, calmly opened the absolute top-heavy wooden drawer of my massive, solid, pristine mahogany wood desk and smoothly, cleanly, quietly pulled out two extremely thin, cheap manila corporate folders. I casually, flawlessly, entirely lightly tossed the two thin physical folders completely directly onto the highly polished, smooth, expensive dark mahogany surface, actively, perfectly letting them slowly, cleanly slide right exactly to the absolute, very perfectly smooth edge. Renee and Jada immediately, completely, intensely, actively stared completely directly at the two thin folders, with incredibly wide, completely terrified, starving, desperate eyes. They genuinely, entirely, fully, completely believed I was finally, successfully, actively handing them a magical, totally, entirely, highly massive, lucrative, physical, financial lifeline today. They entirely, confidently, incredibly, foolishly thought I was heavily, generously giving them highly, incredibly lucrative corporate consulting employment contracts, or actively, heavily, entirely writing them a highly massive, beautiful physical check today, completely, perfectly, exactly right now. Open them immediately, I commanded, incredibly smoothly, actively, leaning heavily, completely, comfortably, perfectly, directly back into my plush, expensive, imported, deep, soft, beautiful black leather corporate executive chair. Renee aggressively reached completely, entirely up with violently, heavily shaking, completely weak, pale hands and forcefully, desperately grabbed the top, cheap, thin folder. She opened it incredibly eagerly, her heavily, deeply bloodshot, completely terrified wet eyes, rapidly, aggressively, heavily, completely scanning the plain, black ink cleanly, perfectly, physically printed, entirely directly on the basic white paper. The entirely tiny, completely pathetic, desperate, entirely brief spark of deep, desperate human hope in her terrified, entirely wet eyes was instantly, entirely, absolutely, completely, permanently extinguished, and violently, entirely, aggressively, heavily replaced by absolute, total, completely unadulterated, pure, entirely complete horror. Jada, aggressively, heavily leaned completely, directly, entirely over her wet, shaking shoulder to quickly, aggressively, successfully, physically, successfully read the highly dense legal printed documents, and she immediately, completely began to actively, physically weep, even incredibly, totally, loudly today, perfectly. The incredibly thin physical papers were entirely, completely, absolutely not highly lucrative, elite, executive, corporate financial contracts. They were absolutely, completely standard entry-level, low entirely, completely low, totally basic, minimum wage, physical employment applications entirely, specifically, completely printed, exactly, precisely for the downtown city, public sanitation, local, physical, completely hard, dirty street department today. You want to safely eat warm meals, I stated, my deep voice completely devoid of any sympathy today. Then you must start by putting on a heavy public uniform and thoroughly cleaning up the disgusting garbage rotting directly in the cold, dirty city streets. You absolutely chose this pathetic, miserable path entirely by yourselves when you happily betrayed me. You are officially, permanently erased from my entire massive financial legacy forever, and absolutely no amount of crying will ever change that final decision. I swiftly signaled my highly trained elite corporate security team to aggressively physically drag them entirely out of the massive glass building as they violently, loudly screamed in pure, agonizing, total despair. I smoothly walked directly toward the thick glass window and peacefully looked out over the glowing, beautiful city skyline, finally feeling at absolute, lasting, perfect peace today, observing the vibrant, wealthy city stretching flawlessly toward the distant blue horizon, completely unbothered forever. Family is not simply granted by a marriage certificate or biological ties. It must be continuously earned through unwavering loyalty, gratitude, and deep mutual respect. When blinding greed overrides basic human decency, the sacred title of family is permanently revoked. True power does not reside in screaming or seeking shallow revenge, but in the quiet stoic discipline of holding toxic individuals entirely accountable for their ruthless actions. Never weaponize your own compassion to protect parasites who would eagerly destroy your life for $1. Ultimately, absolute peace is found in walking away with your unshakable dignity perfectly intact. Subscribe today.